Chapter 955. From his expression, tone, and demeanor, it could be seen that Li Xian was very vexed. In order to fight for the throne, other princes disregarded their brotherhood. They fought openly and secretly, and used all kinds of deadly methods in order not to be the emperor. He couldn't eat or sleep well. He was so haggard that he was constantly thinking about giving up the throne. If the king of Shu, king of Xian, king of Qi, or any other king knew his thoughts, they would probably strangle him to death. Li Xian, who was in a dispirited state, suddenly raised his head and asked, "Do you have wine?" Since the last incident, Li Yi had stopped drinking. However, the person in front of him was his best friend, and he was willing to risk his life to accompany him. It was nothing to make an exception for once. As the crown prince, the future emperor, of course, he had to use the biggest bowl and drink the strongest wine. Li Yi stood up, waved his hand to the back, and said to his servant, "Bring out the best wine in the manor." Soon, a servant came with a jar of wine. Li Yi slapped the lid and poured a bowl for Li Xian and Mingzu respectively. He picked up his teacup and said, "Today there is wine. Today we are drunk. Tomorrow's worries will come tomorrow. Let's drink." Li Xian's alcohol tolerance was not much better than his, but after drinking a large bowl of wine, his whole face was a little red, and his eyes were blurred. This bit of wine was naturally nothing to Mingzu. She drank it more easily than he drank tea. Mississippi Liu walked out of the room, and Rui, Zumo, and Ruoqing also followed. Li Xian looked up and saw Zumo and Ruoqing. He said in surprise, "W, when did you come in?" "Just yesterday." Li Yi looked at him and said, "The wedding is at the end of next month. You can't come at that time, but you can't miss the congratulatory gifts." At that time, Li Xian would already be the heir to the Eastern Palace. His status would rise, and so would the gift. "It's your wedding day, how could I not come?" Li Xian glared at him, then turned his head and asked, "How many?" The expression on Li Yi's face froze. He suddenly felt some regret. He should have made do with the grape wine just now. She poured him another bowl of wine and gritted her teeth. "Do you really need to go through so much trouble?" Li Xian stood up with a red face. He shook his head and said, "Wouldn't it be better to settle everything at once?" He pointed to the yard and said, "Miss Sui Mo, Miss Ruoqing." Then he turned around and pointed. "Your second miss. There's also Mingzu. Tell me, can't you be more straightforward and act like a man?" Li Yi grabbed that bowl, pinched Li Xian's mouth, and poured the entire bowl of wine into his mouth. He then slung Li Xian over his shoulder and said, "He's drunk. I'll bring him to rest. In terms of experience and status, which part of me is inferior to Li Chuang? This throne, why should it be given to him?" In Prince Xian manner, Prince Xian picked up a wine jar. After shaking it a little, he tossed it aside and said loudly, "Go get more wine." In the hall, all the dancers knelt on the ground, trembling with fear. They lowered their heads, not even daring to breathe loudly. Prince Xian was clearly drunk. If they were to infuriate him now, they might even be in danger of losing their lives. Immediately, a servant ran out hurriedly into the wine cellar, picked up a wine jar, and ran out. When he reached the door, he was stopped by someone. He said anxiously, "Quickly make way. This is what His Highness wants. We can't delay it." That servant said in a deep voice, "These are all top-notch strong wines. His Highness has already drunk so much. If he drinks any more, something will happen. If something were to happen to His Highness, none of us will be able to escape." That person's countenance turned pale, and he asked in a trembling voice, Then what should we do?" That servant took the wine jar from him and pointed to another corner. "Take it there. The wine there isn't very strong, so it won't be easy for something to happen." "Many thanks." That person responded, immediately picked up a jar, and ran out. The servant in green placed the wine jar back in its original spot, looked outside, and mumbled, "It's going to be dark soon." Li Yi had thought that Zamo and Ruoqing moving into the house was a joyous occasion. However, by the looks of it now, it did not seem to be entirely the case. He did not know what Rui and Zamo had talked about for the entire day, but they still wanted to sleep together at night. It seemed that they had a lot to talk about, Since Zue Mo and Ruoqing had moved in, Xiao Zhu and Xiao Chui naturally had to move in as well. They were different from ordinary servant girls. Like Xiao Huan, they lived in the inner courtyard with Rui and Rui. With this, there were not enough rooms in the inner courtyard. Li lay on the uncomfortable bed in the study, thinking about whether he should go over and deal with Rui and Zemo since they were sleeping together. Anyway, it was about time. After careful consideration, he still felt that he should not be too complacent. It was not easy to achieve such great progress, and he might not necessarily be able to meet a good person like Prince Xian next time. Although he was no longer complacent, he could not help but feel happy and excited. He lay on the bed, tossing and turning. He did not know what time it was, but he still did not feel sleepy at all. Li Yi stood up, preparing to go to the courtyard to sit, enjoy the wind, and look at the moon. It was better than lying here. The courtyard was very quiet. He walked to the side of the rocking chair and lay down comfortably, placing his hands behind his head. Li Xian was a guy who did not have any tolerance for alcohol. When he was drunk, he would dare to say anything and would never keep his word. Previously, when he was drunk, he had said that he would give the crown prince's consort to him. Until now, he had yet to fulfill his promise. It was the same situation today. If it was not because he had acted fast enough, did he think that he would be able to withstand a few sword attacks from Rui and Emingzu? However, although the situation was not right for him to say those words, his logic was the same. However, there was nothing he could do even if it was troublesome. It was not as if he was going to choose a consort in the future and bring her into the palace after he took a fancy to her. It was something that would happen naturally as their relationship grew. Li gave it some thought and mumbled, Zue Mo will be at the beginning of next year. Ruoqing will be a little later. What about Imingzu? Li frowned and said, Imingzu won't be able to do it for now. What about Rui? Rui. Li suddenly raised his head and saw Mississippi Lu lying on a thick branch of the tree behind him. Her hands were behind her head like him, and her two long legs were crossed. The bright moonlight shone down. Looking up from below, it was as if her whole body was emitting a faint radiance, full of a holy aura. Rui, what are you doing up there? I couldn't sleep, so I came out to look at the moon. Mississippi Lu floated down from the tree and asked curiously, What did you say about Li Mingzu just now? Li waved his hand and said, She can handle political affairs, but her culinary skills are far from good. She can't even make egg fried rice well. She can't even compare to Ruoqing, and she can't even compare to Drunk Ink. She's not much better than you, Rui. Countless lights flashed in his mind. In an instant, he strung the four names together and heaved a sigh of relief. Mississippi Lu looked at him and didn't say a word. Li raised his head and noticed that her face was a little red, appearing a little charming in the night. It wasn't that she was blushing, but that her face had turned red because of the light. She was looking behind him. Li turned back and saw a beam of red light in the distant horizon. No, it was a stretch of red light. Prince Xian's manor was in a state of panic. There's a fire. There's a fire. Quick, put out the fire. Prince Xian's Highness is still in his room. Someone come quickly. This fire can't be extinguished even with water. This is kerosene. The servants of the prince's manor, who had already fallen asleep, were startled awake by the commotion. When they hurriedly put on their clothes and walked out of the door, what they saw was a stretch of fire that soared into the sky, as well as a crowd that was hurriedly scattering in all directions. In a place where no one noticed, a few figures had their hands crossed over their chests. For Her Highness! For Her Highness! For Her Highness! After exchanging a few words in a low voice, they turned around, passed through the panicking crowd, and went against the flow. Their figures soon disappeared. Chapter 956. Winter in Japan was a time when fires were more likely to break out. The weather was cold, and poor people relied on shivering to resist the cold, while wealthy people used charcoal to keep themselves warm. If they were not careful, it would lead to a great disaster. After the Zheng Manor, Prince Xian's manor also caught fire last night. In terms of scale, degree of destruction, and impact, The former was a far cry from the latter. Not only was Prince Exine's manor burned down, but even the manor's two neighbors were also affected. A few houses and the mansions of two officials in the imperial court were burned down. Thankfully, it was discovered in time, and the damage caused was not great. Prince Exine's manor was in a terrible state. The entire manor was in ruins almost overnight. As for Prince Exine himself, he was also in a sorry state from the fire last night. Although his life was not in danger, his hair was burned. When he was escaping from the house, he tripped over the doorsill and broke one of his legs. He was still lying in the Imperial Physician's Bureau. It was said that the fire in Prince Exine's manor was so great that half the sky in the capital was dyed red. It was also said that when Prince Exine escaped from the house yesterday, he was not even wearing any clothes. It was also said that there was another man who also escaped from the house with Prince Exine, who was also not wearing any clothes. Fong walked over with an aggrieved expression and grumbled, "Young master, why didn't you tell me about such a major matter?" Li Yi was holding a copy of Capital Entertainment. The headline on the front page was about Prince Exine's manor being burned down and Prince Exine seemingly coming out of the closet. He raised his eyes to look at Fong and asked, "What's the matter?" "Burning down Prince Exine's manor." Fong sat down opposite him and said, "Young master, you lied to me, saying that you would only take action after he left the capital. I didn't expect that you couldn't even wait a day. Were you really the one who burned down Prince Exine's manor?" Sung Shichen hurried in from outside and looked at Li Yi. You're too rash. No matter what, Prince Exine is still a prince. It's one thing if you wait for him to leave the capital and take action secretly, but you'll make things impossible to resolve. It wasn't me." Li Yi shook his head. He wondered which hero had done a great deed. Although it felt great, it was really baffling that he was the scapegoat. He gave it some thought and said, "Perhaps the people from Prince Exine's manor were careless in keeping themselves warm? Could it be that the people from Prince Exine manor use kerosene for warmth?" Sang Shichen's countenance turned a little grim. The surroundings of Prince Exine's room have been doused with a large amount of kerosene. This is clearly an act of arson. If it wasn't because we discovered it in time, Prince Exine would probably have died in the sea of fire last night. If you think about it, you'll know that I'm not the one who did this. Li Yi shook his head and said, "Prince Exine set fire to the Zung Manor. The Imperial Court can't deal with him, so I'll deal with him myself. However, setting fire to the Prince Exine Manor after only one day, this is too obvious. It's like what you said. I was planning on breaking both of his legs after he left the capital. Now that one of his legs has been broken, I can only break the other two. Are you really going to do it?" Seng Shichen looked at him in shock, then shook his head and said solemnly, "But the people will not think so. They will only make the simplest guesses. Gossip is a fearful thing." Li Yi put down the limited edition Capital Entertainment in his hand, shook his head, and said, "The people in the capital aren't fools. They'll seek justice for me." "Let's hope so." Sung Shichen sighed. "The one who is investigating this case is Lu Dayo. He's a meticulous person and should be able to discover some clues." Li Xian and the princess had come together again. Li Yi had already explained earlier and did not wish to waste his breath. He looked at them and said helplessly, "If I were to say that I have nothing to do with this matter, would you guys believe me? It's him. It must be him." Although Prince Exine's face was no longer as black as before, a large part of his hair had been burnt, and there were still waves of pain in one of his legs. His countenance was savage as he said loudly, "How audacious! He's really audacious. This is the capital, and he set fire to the prince's manor. He's trying to rebel." An official in front of the bed said in a soft voice, "Your Highness Prince Exine, the county office has already sent people to investigate the cause of the fire last night. Please calm down and recuperate in peace." "What's there to investigate? What's there to investigate?" Prince Exine's countenance was infuriated, and he wanted to get up from the bed. However, he accidentally affected his injuries and lay back down. He said loudly, "What's there to investigate? He's taking revenge. He's taking revenge on I for burning down the Zung Manor. Therefore, he came to burn down I's manor. So, the arson at the Zeng Manor last night was instigated by His Highness Prince Exen. Lu Dao stood below, holding a small book in his hand. He wrote a few lines of words and said, "I'll report what His Highness Prince Xin has said without missing a single word. What Zeng Manor? If I want to burn it, I'll burn it down." Prince Xin waved his hand and said in disdain, "But he's burning down the prince's manor. This is treason, and he deserves to have his entire clan executed." After the prince's manor was burned down last night, 4 servants disappeared from Prince Xin's manor. Lu Dao looked at him and said, "According to the butler of the prince's manor, these 4 people bought a batch of strong alcohol from outside yesterday. Judging from the situation at the scene, they didn't buy strong alcohol, but kerosene. It's the kerosene that burned down the entire Prince Xin manor last night." Prince Xin's countenance changed, and he immediately said, "What servants of the prince's manor? He must have gotten someone to impersonate them. He wants to get I killed." According to the butler and the other servants of the prince's manor, the 4 of them were brought here by your highness from your feudal land. Before this, they had already been with your highness for 2 years and have never been to the capital. Therefore, it's impossible for them to be impersonators. Prince Xin was stunned for a moment and then said furiously, "Nonsense! How could the servants of my prince's manor possibly commit arson? We'll have to ask His Highness Prince Xin about this." Lu Dao looked at him and asked, "Your Highness Prince Xin, why don't you think about it carefully? Before you came to the capital, did you offend anyone? For example, some concubine." "What concubine?" Prince Xin slapped the side of the bed fiercely and said furiously, "The only person I offended is him. It must be him." Lu Dao looked at him and said in a soft voice, "Your Highness, please rest well. I'll take my leave." When he walked to the door, he bowed toward a figure who had just entered. "Greetings, Your Highness Prince Qi. Brother Qi King." When Prince Xin saw Prince Qi walk in, his eyes lit up and he said, "Brother Qi King, you've seen how arrogant and despotic he is. If this person isn't eliminated, the imperial court won't be able to have peace." Prince Qi looked around, and the people in the room who had no business in it immediately left. He walked up to Prince Xin and said in a soft voice, "You just sent people to burn down his house the day before yesterday, and he sent people to burn down your prince's manor yesterday. Do you take him to be a fool, or do you take everyone in the world to be fools?" "Brother Qi King." Prince Xin looked at him in disbelief. Even you, do you know what the people outside are saying?" Prince Qi bent down and said, "I heard that the ones who set fire to the prince's manor last night were a few servants from your manor. This trick of yours is too stupid." Prince Xin was speechless. After walking out of the Imperial Physician Bureau, Lu Dao loosened his fists. His palms were covered in sweat. Prince Xin was not scary, and neither was Prince Qi. What was scary was that holy religion, that lady. Before Prince Xin had even arrived in the capital, there were already spies from the holy religion in his manor. Who would dare to say that there were no such people in the other princes, officials, and nobles in the imperial court, or even in his own manor? The power of this holy religion had once again surpassed his expectations. For the lady, Lu Dao's countenance was complicated as he mumbled and left quickly. Chapter 9:57. Holy Religion, Her Highness. Li retracted his gaze from County Magistrate Lu, appearing to be deep in thought. Lu Dao nodded and said, "That's right. The servants in Prince Xin's manor have indeed heard those 4 people saying the words for Her Highness. All the evidence shows that the arson case in Prince Xin's manor last night was done by them." Li Yi's gaze flickered. Could it be that the Taoist nun had come to the capital? Thinking about it carefully, he felt that it was not quite possible. The foundation of the holy religion was in the Qi kingdom. Right now, the Qi kingdom was in a state of chaos, with the first prince and the third prince vying for the throne. The Taoist nun shouldn't let go of such an opportunity, let alone come all the way to the Jing kingdom. Moreover, it was true that Fang Xingjian had not received any news regarding this. However, when had Prince Xin offended the Taoist nun? Fang Xingjian had no way of knowing this either. Li knew that there were people from the holy religion in the capital. However, within this organization, it had always been a one-way communication. The members at the bottom of the hierarchy would not be able to come into contact with the core secrets, and it would also be very difficult for outsiders to infiltrate the organization. Even the intelligence department, which had strict control over the organization, knew very little about them. Setting fire to Prince Xian's manor. It could not be ruled out that they wanted to create some big news while the imperial court meeting was nearing. Prince Xian was just lucky to have been chosen by them. No matter what, at a time like this, the authorities would still have to take strict precautions. Li looked at Fang Xingjian, gave it some thought, and said, "Although these people are very well hidden, there will always be some clues. You should pay attention to the cases of people going missing in the suburbs of the capital or the abnormal movements of some villages. You should be able to discover something." From Li, Lu Daiyou obtained a lot of information about the holy religion. When he walked out of the Li mansion, he felt as if he had forgotten something, but he couldn't tell what exactly he had overlooked. Although the death of the son of the former assistant minister of the Ministry of Works and the burning of Prince Xian's manor were very far apart, they should have been done by the same group of people. What was their motive? What was the connection between these two cases? Lu Daiyou rubbed his slightly swollen head. Prince Xian's manor had only been burned down, and no one had died. He had to put this matter aside for now. Quite a lot had happened in the capital this year, and he had to immediately start preparing to report his work at the imperial court meeting. Li didn't think much about the holy religion. Their influence in the Jing kingdom was limited, and the capital was under heavy pressure. After setting fire to Prince Xian's manor, they had already given themselves away a little. If they were to make another move, they would definitely not be able to hide from the imperial court's pursuit. What he should be concerned about was the matter at hand. Although drunken Imo hadn't married into the family yet, she was already the third mistress of the house. For the past 2 days, Rui had been guiding her to familiarize herself with the matters of the house. Today, she was brought over by the old mistress to meet someone. With Rui accompanying her, Mississippi Lu had gone to the Alliance, leaving only him and Ruoqing at home. When he sat in the courtyard, Ruoqing brought a cup of hot tea over. Li thought of something and said, "If you want to go out or go to the brothel these few days, I'll accompany you. Don't go out alone." Those people from the holy religion were all lunatics. Li was still a little worried that the Taoist nun would make a comeback and lay her hands on the people around him. Although the possibility of this was very low, he couldn't let them take this risk. Ruoqing looked at him with some worry and asked, "Did something happen?" Prince Xian's residence was burned down. It was done by the people from the holy religion. "I'm worried that they'll do something bad to you." Holy religion? Ruoqing was stunned and asked with some uncertainty. Prince Xian's residence was burned down by them. Li nodded and said, "I don't know how Prince Xian offended their heavenly empress, causing those followers to go crazy and take revenge. But he deserved it," Ruoqing said in a low voice. "That heavenly empress should be very powerful. I don't know if she's powerful in other places, but her martial arts are quite powerful. The influence of the holy religion can't be underestimated either. If we were to go up against them, the imperial court would probably have a headache." Li suddenly remembered that he still had the token of the holy sect. It was a token that said that he was under one person and above tens of thousands of people. If something happened to the Taoist nun one day, after thinking about it carefully, he felt that it was best not to have any contact with those people. Although it was true that the influence was very powerful, all of them had been brainwashed and were like terrorists. Just the thought of being surrounded by such people made him feel uncomfortable. Ruoqing asked in a probing manner, "What if the imperial court captures that heavenly empress?" "There probably won't be a good outcome." Li shook his head and said, "The people from the holy religion are cruel and have probably done a lot of things to harm the imperial court. If the imperial court were to capture their heavenly empress, they'll definitely not let her off. When that time comes, there'll probably be a great commotion in the world." With the Taoist nun gathering such a huge power, no one would believe her if she said that she did not want to rebel. Since ancient times, there had been many such examples. When that time came, Blood would definitely flow like rivers and corpses would be strewn all over the place. Ruwaching did not continue asking. She smiled and said, "The brothel has been very busy these few days. I like to go over and take a look." Since he had nothing to do at home, Li stood up and said, "I'll go with you." After sending Ruwaching to the brothel, Li and the sloppy old man found a quiet place to drink tea and watch the performance while waiting for her to finish her business. "Miss Wan." "Hello, Sister Ruwaching." "Nice to meet you, Miss Ruwaching." As Ruwaching walked over, the performers in the brothel all bowed to her. They respected and appreciated her from the bottom of their hearts. She was the one who had changed the industry and allowed them, who had traveled from state to state and slept on the streets, to live the good life they had now. After walking into her room, she ordered, "Xiaoqi, go find Su Zheng and ask him to come over." "All right, I'll go right now." A young girl nodded and walked out of the door. Su Zheng was also very famous in the brothel. In the beginning, he had only been a beggar, doing some cleaning every day in exchange for porridge. However, because he was serious and diligent in his work, not fearing hardship or fatigue, he was later promoted to work in the brothel as an exception. Many people here knew of him. Not long later, a young man walked in from outside and gently closed the door. He turned around and suddenly knelt on the ground, saying respectfully, "Your subordinate pays his respects to the goddess." Ruwaching rubbed the area between her brows and said helplessly, "I've already said many times that I'm not your goddess." "You've got the wrong person." Su Zheng did not say anything else, but the respect on his face became even more intense. Ruwaching did not argue with him. She stood up, looked at him, and asked, "Are you people from that holy religion?" "It's the goddess's holy religion." She clenched her fists slightly and asked again, "Prince Exen Manor, was it you people who burned it?" Su Zheng said solemnly, "He wanted to harm the goddess, so he must be punished." Her knuckles were slightly white, and her voice trembled slightly. "Then, the son of the assistant minister of works, those people, are also all of them deserve to die for attempting to harm the goddess." Ruwaching sat back down on the chair, somewhat weakly. Her face was pale as she mumbled, "I'm not your goddess." "You. Why are you?" The young man buried his head even deeper and said, "Your Highness, the authorities have already noticed our existence. The capital is no longer safe. For your Highness's safety, this subordinate suggests that we leave this place as soon as possible. Get out. Your Highness, please reconsider. Get out." She had always spoken softly and gently, but at this moment, her tone was so decisive and unquestionable. "This subordinate obeys," Su Zheng said respectfully. Without raising his head, he stood up and left decisively. She stared blankly at the empty room, then leaned over the table and sobbed softly. "Why me? Why now? I'm not the heavenly empress." When he saw her watching again, he was startled. He looked into her eyes and asked, "What's wrong?" Looking at her appearance, it was clear that she had just cried. Ever since he had known Ruwaching, he had never seen her cry over anything. "It's nothing. I just read a script. It was too sad, so I couldn't hold it in." She smiled and shook her head. "Let's go home." "What script?" Li asked in surprise. He suddenly felt a warm and soft touch on his hand. He lowered his head to look at it and subconsciously clenched it. He no longer cared about the script. He nodded and said, "Yes, let's go home." Chapter 958. The case of the burning of Prince Exine's manor had exposed certain matters, causing the two yamens in the capital and the city patrol office, which were in charge of security in the capital, to be extremely careful. Fortunately, in the next few days, everything was as calm as before, and no similar malicious incidents occurred. The New Year's Eve dinner of the Li family this year was undoubtedly much livelier than last year's. There was less Lin Wanru, but more Zue Mo and Ruwaching. Lin Wanru would often send letters, mostly about business matters. The Lin family's business was doing very well in the Qi Kingdom. Not only did it involve the jewelry industry, but it was also flourishing everywhere. Of course, the Lin family's business was the Li family's business. The two families were mutually beneficial, and it was a symbiotic relationship. When the two girls had just moved in, they were still a little unfamiliar with this place, but a few days were enough for them to familiarize themselves with everything. Even Xiao Chui and Xiao Zhu had gotten along well with the servant girls of the Li family. Xiao Huan also had two more playmates. Usually, the servant girls of the Li family treated her as half a mistress, and they didn't dare to speak or do things too presumptuously. Gradually, she didn't play with them anymore. Friendship between women always came especially easily. Xiao Chui had a strange personality, and it was very easy for people to accept her. In just half a day, the wariness and resistance between the three of them disappeared without a trace. The first day of Jing He's 5th year was the long-awaited court conference. Li woke up very early. This was one of the rare times that he didn't resist going to court because many major events were going to happen today. Some of them would be earth-shaking to the officials, to the people, and to the Jing kingdom. The sky was still dark. Other than some servants who needed to wake up early, most of the people in the manor hadn't woken up yet. Rui helped him iron his court clothes. Ruoqing came in with a bowl of porridge and said softly, "Have a bowl of porridge before you go. The court conference will go on for several hours. By the time you get back, it will probably be afternoon. You'll be hungry." Rui walked over and said helplessly, "Miss Ruoqing is a guest. I'm sorry to trouble you to cook personally." Ruoqing smiled and didn't care at all. She said, "It doesn't matter. I'm used to getting up early. I used to make breakfast for Zuamo and the others first. There's more in the kitchen. When they wake up later, I'll ask someone to bring it over." Li Yi gulped down the bowl of porridge, leaving not a single grain of rice. Ruoqing habitually took out a handkerchief, wanting to help him wipe the rice off the corner of his mouth. She had just raised her wrist when she slowly retracted it. She picked up the bowl, smiled, turned around, and walked out. Rui walked over and helped him wipe the corners of his mouth. She said casually, "Miss Ruoqing is smart and virtuous. She is also a very good woman. In some ways, Ruoqing is very similar to my wife. The most similar thing is that she is virtuous." After nodding, Li looked at the sky and said, "It's getting late." He reached out and pulled Rui into his arms. His lips gently pressed on her forehead. When he turned around, he waved his hand. "It's still early. Go to sleep for a while, my wife. I'm leaving." There was no snow in the winter of Jinghe 4th year, but it was undoubtedly colder than the previous winters. When the sky was slightly bright, the officials had already rushed to the palace gate one after another, ready to participate in this year's grand court meeting. On weekdays, the officials were required to be well-groomed. They couldn't wear too thick clothes under their court robes. Otherwise, they would be caught by the censors. It was unlikely that they would lose their position, but it would be a great humiliation. The morning wind was biting. For the officials who only wore a thin court robe, it was undoubtedly a great torment. Therefore, in front of the palace gate, there were countless officials rubbing their hands and stamping their feet. The censors turned a blind eye to this. After all, if they were to scrutinize them, their almost frozen snot would be considered as not caring about their appearance. Of course, there were also those who weren't cold. When Li Yi came over, he immediately saw the old generals in the crowd who were dressed like bears. The imperial court sympathized with the officials and gave preferential treatment to the elderly. For example, Prime Minister Qin and Prime Minister Shun didn't have to stand there and wait. They could only go in after the officials had entered the main hall. For example, these old generals didn't care too much about their appearance. It wasn't because the emperor was being merciful, but because the censors didn't dare to interfere. "Brat, why are you here so early today? I haven't seen you in court for more than half a year. I thought you wouldn't come today." This time around, Li Yi wasn't as warm to old General Shui. He was almost certain that these old generals were the first to know of the old emperor's decision. For so long, he and Mingzu had been deceived by their superb acting skills. Old General Shui patted his shoulder and sighed. "Sigh, brat, you can't blame us. There's no benefit in knowing about that matter too early." Li Yi shook his head and didn't dwell on this problem anymore. Since things had already come to this, there was no longer any meaning to what had happened in the past. At the very least, that person was Li Xian and not Prince Qi or Prince Exant. Speaking of the King of Qi, the king of Qi arrived. Today, the king of Qi was dressed in a particularly spirited manner, brimming with health and vigor. Wearing only a thin embroidered robe, he strode with his head held high, seemingly unafraid of the bitter cold. Young people are really tough. Old General Shui shook his head and said, "Not like us old fellows. If we were to wear such thin clothes in such weather, we would be in trouble when we return." Old General Ma glanced at him and said, "You can't get hard now because you were the same as him when you were young." Old General Shui was enraged. "Old man Ma, who can't get hard?" Old General Ma said disdainfully, "Why don't you try getting hard? Why don't we have a competition? I'm afraid of you." Out of all the civil and military officials in the imperial court, there were probably only these two who dared to do this openly in front of so many officials. Most of the officials didn't care about who was tougher between the two generals. Their focus was on Prince Qi. "Your Highness, Prince Qi. Greetings, Your Highness. Your Highness, please." Prince Qi's arrival caused a brief commotion in front of the palace gates. The censors looked at each other and ignored him. That was then, and this was now. After today, the Prince of Qi would likely become the heir apparent, second only to one. Choosing to offend him at this time was not a wise decision. Prince Qi was beaming with joy. He was very satisfied with the results of his arrival. He liked the feeling of being fawned over by others. Now that the situation was settled, he could finally relax. However, he naturally wouldn't pay attention to those officials whose names he didn't even know. He walked straight ahead. In front of him was where the top officials from the 3 provinces and 6 ministries gathered. "Minister Yin, Your Highness, Prince Qi." The Prince of Qi cupped his hands towards the Minister of War, Yin Bing. Yin Bing cupped his hands in return, before turning to the Minister of Revenue at his side. With a smile, he asked, "Where's the tea house that Lord Qin mentioned last time?" Qin Huan smiled and said, "It's in Willow Alley. If Lord Yin wants to go, why don't we go together after the court today? That would be great." Looking at the 2 ministers chatting happily, Prince Qi opened his mouth and closed it again. A trace of displeasure flashed across his face. Soon, a smile appeared on his face again, and he turned to look at the other people. Before he could say anything, voices came from the crowd. "Ah, Lord Zhang, why do you smell so good? Did you secretly use your wife's perfume? You could smell it too? Lord Wei looks especially spirited today. Is that so? Is that thing really effective? What is it?" Lord Qi might not know, but Rui Workshop released a new product a few days ago, Rui Dew. It's specially designed for men. It can refresh the mind, adjust emotions, relieve stress, reflect one's taste in life, and enhance one's charm. Is that so? There's such a good thing? I want to try it too. Prince Qi found that he had been ignored again. The officials who had been waiting quietly had suddenly started chatting. He had no way of interrupting them. With a gloomy face, he walked to his seat. "Brother Qi, greetings, Brother Qi. Greetings, Brother Qi." Prince Qi was the eldest among the princes, so they all bowed to him. Li Yi glanced at the Prince of Qi, who was surrounded like a moon surrounded by stars. Flabbergasted, he asked, "What are they doing?" Old General Shui said indifferently, "They probably think that Prince Qi already has 1 foot in the East Palace." "Where did you hear this from?" Li shook his head and said, "How strange. How did Prince Qi already have 1 foot in the East Palace? Rumors are harmful." Old General Ma looked at Li Yi and suddenly turned to Old General Shui and said, "Old Shui, I think this kid has some of your demeanor when you were young." Old General Shui was furious. "Ma, how dare you scold me?" Chapter 959. Li felt that he had to improve his judgment of people in the future. He should not make friends with people who were not decent, especially those who were old and frivolous. To discuss who was tougher in front of so many officials, it was clear that he had no sense of shame at all. He was so frivolous that he had no bottom line. It was important not to get too close to such people. Looking at old General Shui's humiliated expression, Li Yi sighed and said, "I feel that cooperating with the Wang clan in the military provisions business seems to be more suitable. The Wang clan is a big family with a lot of money and foolish people. How about this? I'll give you the dividends that the two generals deserve this month. Even if the business doesn't work out, we'll still be able to keep in touch in the future. Haha, I'm just joking. The military provisions business was a source of income for the clan. Old General Shue's countenance changed, and he put his arm around Fang Xingjian's shoulder, saying with a smile, "Among the younger generation in the capital? No, there's also the older generation. Among them, I admire you the most. We can discuss this. Old fogey Shue, you were scolding me in a roundabout way just now, and now you're sticking to me. Don't you know shame?" Old General Ma threw a disdainful glance at Old General Shue, walked over, patted Li Yi's shoulder, and said, "Li lad, you shouldn't cooperate with an ungrateful person like Old Fogey Shue for this kind of business. Kick the Shue clan out, and our Ma clan is willing to pay another 10,000 taels. Old Fogey Ma, your clan is connected to this business because of me. Now, you want to get rid of me after I've outlived my usefulness? I'm going to kill you, you shameless old fogey. The lad, don't stop me. Today, I'm going to let old Fogey Ma know how many eyes Prince Ma has. Don't worry, I won't stop you. Please go ahead." Li Yi quietly returned to his seat, watching the two of them fight. He unintentionally turned his head and took a glance, noticing that there was a gaze on him. When Prince Xian had escaped from the fire, he had broken his leg. However, it had been reattached by the imperial physicians. Other than some slight difficulty in walking, it was not a big problem. His hair was burned, but when he tied it up and put on the crown, it didn't look much different. At this moment, he was standing among the princes, looking straight at her, not hiding the hatred in his eyes. He was a little puzzled. Wasn't the one who had set fire to Prince Xian's manor? Wasn't it that fanatical believer of the holy religion? Why did Prince Xian hate him so much? Had he ever offended him? I don't think so. He was clearly not the one who burned his house, yet he was still glaring at him like this. Li Yi glared back with a sharp gaze, and Prince Xian shivered. He could not help but take a few steps back and fall onto the ground. What happened to Brother Xian? Someone hurriedly went over to support him. At this moment, the palace gates suddenly opened slowly. The officials immediately shut their mouths and returned to their original positions. The opening of the palace doors signified the official start of the Grand Court Conference. A middle-aged eunuch walked out from inside and shouted loudly with a sharp and thin voice, "All officials request an audience." Li Yi's position was extremely close to the front among the officials. He walked through the palace gate and passed through a long passageway. Other than the sound of his footsteps, there were no other noises. When he walked into the hall and turned his head to look, the crowd was still so dense that he could not see the end of it. The Grand Court Conference was the one with the highest number of officials participating. Other than the officials and nobles in the capital, the local officials from various places would also be present. This was the only chance for most of them to be present in a year. Rewards, punishments, promotions, demotions, and demotions would all be in this conference. As usual, the old emperor arrived late. Li Yi noticed that the emperor's originally straight back was now completely bent. Rather than saying that he was sitting on the throne, it would be better to say that he was leaning against it. With his current physical condition, it was no longer suitable for him to participate in such an extremely tiring event. However, for an emperor, if he could not even participate in the annual Grand Court Conference, then there would be no meaning for him to be an emperor. Every year, the process of the Grand Court Conference was the same. This year, Emperor Jing did not speak much. Naturally, there were eunuchs who followed the procedure step by step. Other than a few ceremonial contents at the beginning, the one that lasted the longest and had the most people participating was the reports of the local officials and the various departments of the court. The local officials needed to report on the tax revenue, population, economy, education, and other conditions under their jurisdiction. This was related to their promotions and examinations in the coming year. This year, the 6 ministries had vigorously implemented reforms. Naturally, they had to report on the results of this year's reforms. Li Yi patiently listened for nearly 4 hours. The changes that the Jing Kingdom had achieved over the past few years could be described as earth-shattering. Regardless of whether it was politics, economy, or military, they had all made significant progress. Of course, almost all of these matters have been decided upon after detailed discussions between him and Immerse. Achieving such results was within his expectations. He casually glanced ahead and saw Li Xian in the crowd. Compared with the high-spirited Prince of Qi, Li Xian seemed a little listless. At some point, he raised his head and looked at Li Yi. His eyes were slightly empty. Li Yi looked away and no longer looked at him. For Li Xian, this was indeed a cruel thing. However, his identity and status had doomed him to bear this burden. In the world of adults, there was no such thing as easy. Either you change the world or you change yourself. After many officials finished their reports, as usual, they had to announce some major events. This was also what everyone was most looking forward to. All signs indicated that the position of the Eastern Palace would be settled in this grand court conference. After the last official retreated, the eunuch looked back. After receiving a signal, he slowly turned his head and said loudly, "Bring the sinners of the Chui family here." In the main hall, the hundreds of officials stepped aside to make a path. They watched as the palace guards escorted a few people up and made them kneel in the hall. They were incomparably familiar with these people, because just a few months ago, these people were just like them, sitting in the same court. Perhaps they had even argued about certain matters, but now, these important figures of the Chui family, who were once extremely powerful, were kneeling in front of them just like that. The eunuch cleared his throat and read, "The Chui family plotted to murder the prince. Their evil intentions are punishable. They brought disaster to the court and caused chaos among the people. Their crimes are too numerous to be listed. If we don't kill such evil people, we won't be able to appease the anger of the people. If we don't kill them, we won't be able to comfort the people. Chui Qingze, Chui Qingming, Chui Qingduo, and 13 others have committed the most heinous crimes. They will be beheaded as a warning to others. Chui Xian will be deprived of the title of imperial concubine. She will live in Yiding forever and will not be allowed to leave the palace. Chui Ming, Chui Xian, and 26 others will be exiled 1,500 miles. Chui Zheng, Chui Jian." The case of the Chui family, which was tantamount to treason, had already caused a sensation in the capital several months ago. Although it had been quiet these days, everyone could predict the final outcome of the Chui family. But no one had expected that His Majesty would announce the results of the case at the Grand Court Conference. Several important figures of the Chui family could not escape death. Most of the others were also exiled and would not be able to return to the capital in this life. Imperial concubine Chui was in the cold palace and would not be able to come out for the rest of her life. Although there was no mention of how to deal with the king of Shu, his actions were already equivalent to defection. Once he appeared, he would definitely be surrounded and suppressed by the court. It was really a pity that the once powerful Chui family had ended up like this. Chapter 960. However, the Chui family had only themselves to blame for such a result, so no one was surprised, because the crimes they committed were too serious. They plotted to kill a prince, the legitimate son of the emperor. In order to let the king of Shu ascend the throne, they killed the 2 princes of the empress. They didn't stop until the birth of the eldest princess. The empress couldn't bear another child, and no one could shake the position of the eldest son of the king of Shu. The Chui family, an imperial concubine Chui, used such cruel means to ensure that the king of Shu would ascend the throne. They probably didn't expect that the throne would eventually fall into the hands of Prince Qi, who they had never taken seriously. After the eunuch announced the result, the Chui family was taken away. Then, a few dry coughs suddenly came from the hall. The Chui family has committed heinous crimes, and it's not a pity that they finally got such a bad result. Prime Minister Qin walked out of the crowd, glanced down, and said, "You all know that the Chui family is insane. In order to establish the position of the eldest son of the king of Shu, they secretly killed the 2 princes of the empress. However, I'm afraid you don't know that the 3rd child of the empress was also a prince, right?" As soon as the words came out, the officials were in an uproar. "What? Prime Minister Qin, Are you serious? How is that possible? The third child of the Empress is obviously the eldest princess. Yes, I still remember that the Empress and Princess Ning gave birth at the same time. Princess Ning gave birth to Crown Prince Li Xian. The Empress, the uproar lasted for a long time. Even the censors did not stop them, because they were deeply shocked and incredulous after hearing Prime Minister Qin's words. Gradually, the uproar subsided. Finally, someone found some clues. The Empress and Princess Ning gave birth at the same time. The Empress gave birth to the eldest princess, and Princess Ning gave birth to Crown Prince Li Xian. Prime Minister Qin said that the Empress actually gave birth to a prince, Prime Minister Shun. The ministers of the 6 ministries and several other officials in the court looked calm, as if they had already known about it. County Marquis Li and several old generals, who were most trusted by His Majesty, were also not surprised. Most importantly, when Prime Minister Qin said these words, His Majesty did not stop him. Thinking about it, the Empress had lost 2 princes. If His Majesty didn't have any doubt in his heart, it would be unreasonable. Thinking deeper, why did Ning Wangfei come to the capital when she was about to give birth? Why did the Empress also move out of the imperial palace at that time and move with Ning Wangfei? The more he thought about it, In the hall, the doubts on the faces of the officials gradually disappeared. The various princes appeared astonished. Prince Xian's countenance turned pale, and Qi King's body trembled, unable to stand steadily. Prime Minister Qin spoke again. Back then, Her Highness lost 2 princes in succession. His Majesty already had some doubts, but the Cui family was powerful. Not only could they stir up the court, but they could even directly intervene in the court. In order to protect the princes, His Majesty made such a decision. His Majesty handed the princes over to Prince Ning and brought the princess back to the palace. Until now, Prime Minister Qin took out a box from his sleeve and said, "This is the Jade Archive that proves the identities of the 2 princes. If any of you don't believe me, you can come forward and verify its authenticity. Whenever a member of the royal family was born, their identity Jade Archive would be engraved at the same time they were born. If this Jade Archive was really from 20 years ago, then Crown Prince Li Xian was the princes of the first line." What Prime Minister Qin had said would naturally not be false. A few senior officials walked forward. After carefully verifying the Jade Archive, they nodded slightly and silently retreated. At this point, the officials no longer had many doubts. With the deaths of the first 2 princes, His Majesty grew suspicious. In order to protect the 3rd prince, he exchanged him with Ning Wangfei's remaining daughter. Therefore, Crown Prince Li Xian was actually the legitimate son of His Majesty and Her Highness. Princess Royal. It should be called Princess now. At this moment, the eunuch cleared his throat and continued. For the past 3 years, I have been ill for a long time. Thus, all the government affairs have been decided by Mingzu. As a woman, Mingzu has been in charge of the important affairs of the court. She has been working hard day and night and has never been tired. Therefore, I hereby grant her the title of Princess Yongla. It was not uncommon for a princess to be granted the title of princess. In the past few decades, there have been a few princesses who had been granted the title of princess due to their favoritism. Putting aside the degree of Princess Mingzhu's favoritism, she had contributed greatly to the court, the people, and the Jing kingdom. A mere title of princess was nothing at all. After reading an imperial edict, the eunuch picked up another one. With a solemn face, he said loudly, "Since ancient times, the emperors have inherited the heavens and ruled the world. They must establish the crown prince and prolong the country. My legitimate son, Li Xian, is a heroic and extraordinary person. Following the will of the heavens, I hereby abide by the first imperial edict and submit to the public opinion. I solemnly inform the heavens and the earth, the ancestral temple, and the country to confer the title of crown prince and appoint him as the crown prince in the East Palace. I have been ill for a long time and cannot be neglected for too long. I hereby appoint the crown prince, Li Xian, as the leader to hold the imperial seal and establish the government hall. Princess Yongla will be his assistant. The two of them will manage the affairs of the commoners and supervise the country. All the matters reported by the officials will be decided by the two of them. Thump! As soon as the eunuch finished his words, Prince Chi's face turned pale. He trembled and collapsed on the ground. Then, the entire hall fell into absolute silence. Almost everyone had a look of contemplation on their faces. No one spoke. 2 imperial edicts and 3 matters. Princess Yonla had just become Princess Yonla and was given the title of princess by His Majesty. The title remained the same, but the meaning was completely different. Li Xian, the legitimate prince whom His Majesty had entrusted to Prince Ning many years ago, naturally became the crown prince and entered the East Palace. The third matter was also the most important. The crown prince supervising the country and the eldest princess assisting the government. This was something that had never happened in previous dynasties. It was also the first thing they thought of and felt incredible. But when they thought about it carefully, they felt that it couldn't be more normal. The country and the court had long been inseparable from the eldest princess. If the eldest princess was a man, they would disobey the emperor's order and admonish her to death. They would let her sit in the position that should have been hers. However, she wasn't. This was already the best and most suitable ending. Crown Prince Li Xian was the legitimate prince and also the most powerful one among all the princes of His Majesty. It was he who promoted the Academy of Science and made a great contribution to the country. But he only knew science and didn't know how to govern the country. He was not the most suitable person to sit in the position. Someone knew. His Majesty gave the princess the title of princess again so that she could rightfully sit in the position and exercise the power of assisting the government. As for Prince Chi, flushed with success, the horse's hooves were swift. The horse accidentally lost its footing. It turned out that from the beginning to the end, Prince Chi had never touched that position. He didn't do it before, and he wouldn't do it in the future. As for why they thought that Prince Chi was already on the throne, he felt that many people were looking at him with unkind eyes. He felt as if his back was being pricked by needles. He slightly tilted his head and asked the Minister of Revenue beside him, "Lord Qin, why are they looking at me?" Qin Huan looked at him for a long time and finally couldn't help asking, "I'm also very curious. Why did Lord Li accept Prince Chi's gift?" Li Yi thought for a while and said, "He sent it to me. Isn't it a little impolite to return it?" Chapter 961. The Grand Court Conference was coming to an end. Too many things had happened in this year's Grand Court Conference. It was full of twists and turns. The unsolved case from more than 20 years ago, the conviction of the Chui family, the mystery of the origin of the eldest princess and Prince Li Xian, the confirmation of the position of the East Palace, and the future situation in the imperial court. The crown prince had been crowned. The country was stable. The eldest princess assisted the government, and the imperial court was stable. All the unstable factors in the past 4 years of Jing He had been cleared today. There was no doubt that from the 5th year of Jing He, the Jing kingdom would open a new era that had never been created by previous emperors. The last item of each year's Grand Court Conference was the reward for the meritorious officials in the past year. The Jing kingdom was now in full swing of the reform, and many of the measures had achieved initial results. The eldest princess was good at using people, and she specialized in special tasks. In the past year, outstanding talents emerged in all fields, so that the last item of the Grand Court Conference lasted half an hour longer than that of the previous years. Many people received generous rewards. The imperial court no longer promoted nobility, but many people were promoted to official positions. Among them, the reward for County Marquis Li was only a few words, and it was not generous. But people were not surprised about it. In the past year, County Marquis Li did not do anything earth-shattering as usual. That was because his actions had already seeped into all aspects. Up until now, in the imperial court, everyone knew that the Jing kingdom's current progress was mostly due to the eldest princess, and he was the person who stood behind the princess. Almost every decree and action of the princess had a shadow behind it. He had made great contributions, but he did not need to be rewarded. In terms of title, He was already a marquis at a young age. One more step was the limit that a foreign official could reach. In terms of official position, he was already a minister of the imperial court, a third-rank official. Although it was a nominal title, he had real power. In terms of relationship, he was the most favored official of the emperor. As long as the emperor was still alive, no one could touch him. The current crown prince, the future emperor, was his best friend. The officials could not imagine how close they were. The current princess, whose status was only below that of the crown prince, had always had an unclear relationship with him. Who was in front of whom? Who was behind whom? Who was at the top and who was at the bottom? These kinds of questions, in fact, cannot be said clearly. He no longer needed to raise his status through promotions. Such a person had long since become a mountain that all officials and nobles could not surpass. Li did not care about these rewards at all. In fact, he did not even remember what the eunuch had just read. Old foxes, they were all old foxes. He had thought that Li Xian would become the crown prince and then inherit the throne. Who would have thought that something like this would happen? Princess Imingzu had become Princess Imingzu again. Furthermore, she was assisted by Princess Imingzu. What was the difference between this and the past? With Li Xian's temperament, how could he sit still in that position? Even if he were to become the emperor, he would have enough authority to open the door for the Science Academy. He would definitely throw all the political affairs of the court to Imingzu. Anyway, wasn't there an imperial edict? Who was in charge and who was in charge? There was no clear boundary between them. The imperial court meeting was about to end, and only the final ceremony was left. Some of the officials clearly still held quite a bit of resentment toward Count Marquis Li. This matter was originally very vague, and no one knew what His Majesty was thinking. Before the imperial court session, they didn't dare to take any rash actions. However, just because Count Marquis Li had beaten up Prince Xian and accepted Prince Qi's gift, some people clearly stood on Prince Qi's side. In the end, Prince Qi lost his footing, and they fell miserably as well. Li felt depressed to begin with. Sensing the gazes from the side, he turned his head and said fiercely, "What are you looking at? If you continue looking, I'll dig out your eyeballs." That official's body trembled, and he immediately retracted his neck. After all, the other party had already become the existence with the most profound background in this dynasty. Even the princes could not afford to offend him, let alone them. After the imperial court meeting ended, most of the officials who had come from afar would also go and check on their connections, staying until after the Lantern Festival. The matter of setting up the crown prince wasn't just to be discussed in the imperial court. Such a major matter of the country should be announced to the world. Notices were pasted on the palace walls and city gates. Within a short half a day, everyone in the capital knew about it. The identity of the eldest legitimate son, the secrets of the royal family, the position of the Eastern Palace. These were all topics that the commoners were extremely interested in. Li appeared to be a little dispirited. Right now, the situation was set. Li Xian was in charge, and Imingzu was in charge. There was no one in the entire Jing kingdom who could stop them from doing what they wanted to do. Without any obstacles or enemies, he seemed to have nothing else to do. He had no interest in the imperial court and did not wish to be promoted. With his business to this extent, silver was nothing more than a number to him. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that he was standing at the peak of his life. If you're to go further up, he might only be able to pull Li Xian down from his position and take it himself. However, this was too easy for him. He didn't consider it. By the way, he also promised Rui that he would go to the Wu Kingdom to see her little disciple, and he couldn't go alone. In the past few years, he had been really tired of staying in the capital. He would take Rui and the others to travel around and see the world. Of course, before that, he had to at least marry Zuamo in a dignified manner. And then watching, he took back what he had said just now. He still had things to do. Xiao Huan. From the morning until now, he had only eaten a bowl of porridge and was a little hungry. Li habitually called Xiao Huan a few times, only to realize that Xiao Huan, Rui, and Zuamo had gone out in the morning. During the New Year festival, there were some inevitable gatherings and social engagements. In the past, it was Rui who brought Xiao Huan along. As the second madam of the Li family, Emma naturally had to go with them this year. Li, what's the matter? Xiao Huan didn't agree, but saw Xiao Zhu running out of the room. Go, and tell the kitchen to make a few dishes and bring a pot of grape wine. Okay, I'll go now. Xiao Zhu responded and ran back in a hurry. Li Yi was startled and reminded her, the kitchen is outside. You're running in the wrong direction. In a clean and tidy room, a beautiful woman sat at the table, slowly flipping through the pages of a book. Sister Ruoqing. The sound of light footsteps came from the door, and the young girl knocked on the door and walked in. Ruoqing put down the book, turned to look at her, and asked, What's wrong? Xiao Zhu rolled her eyes and said, Lily is hungry. He said he wants to eat the food cooked by Miss. Ruoqing got up and walked over, pinched her nose, and said, You wouldn't say that. It's you who wants to eat it, right? Xiao Zhu smiled embarrassedly and said, I'm just thinking for him. After all, he also likes to eat the food cooked by Sister Ruoqing. Ruoqing shook her head helplessly and said, You go play by yourself for a while. I'll go cook. Xiao Zhu smiled and nodded. Watching her walk out the door, the smile on her face disappeared, and she sighed, shaking her head helplessly. My miss is really silly, and Li's also a big idiot. It's obviously a good opportunity for the two of them to be alone, but one of them is reading in the room, and the other is sitting in the yard in a daze. These two people, when will they stop worrying about me? But if it's just eating, it seems like it's still lacking something. Yes, it's lacking grape wine. The weather is cold, and grape wine needs to be warmed before it can be drunk. The Li family has a special wine cellar. Xiao Zhu jogged over, and a servant in the room immediately said, Sister Xiao Zhu, what's the matter? In the hearts of all the servants, Miss Xiao Huan, Miss Xiao Chui, and Miss Xiao Zhu are all different from the other servant girls and must be treated with respect. That, your master wants to drink. Help me get a jug of grape wine. I'll go get it right away. Wait a minute. The servant turned around and asked in confusion, Sister Xiao Zhu, is there anything else? Xiao Zhu thought for a moment and said, Bring a small jug of strong wine, the strongest kind. Chapter 962. Li Xian succeeded to the throne, and Mingzu assisted him. All the external and internal crises were swept away. After the court meeting, Lu Yi submitted a report revealing the existence of an extremely terrifying secret force near the capital. It called itself the Holy Religion, and the person who controlled this force was called the Empress. The case of the son of the former assistant minister of the Ministry of Works and the burning of Prince Xian's mansion were both the work of this force called the Holy Religion. It was still unknown whether they had committed any other crimes. As for how big this Holy Religion was and the purpose of their existence, no one knew. The court naturally attached great importance to this matter. The officials and nobles of the capital would not tolerate such an unstable factor appearing under the feet of the emperor. The determination of the court could be seen from the fact that the Secret Intelligence Office, Supreme Court, Ministry of Justice, and the two offices of the capital were investigating this case at the same time. This was also the first decree the crown prince made after he became the ruler. If the capital wanted to be stable, the Holy Religion must be eliminated. Of course, this matter had nothing to do with Li Yi. Li Yi had thought that he would have nothing to do for a long time. He sat in the yard and thought for a while. Only then did he realize that he didn't have to work for them anymore. He still had a lot of things to solve. It wasn't until he smelled a fragrance that he came back to his senses. Seeing Ruoqing put a few dishes on the table, he asked in surprise, These? Did you cook them yourself? In fact, this question was unnecessary. The chefs of the Li family couldn't make such delicious dishes. I have nothing to do anyway. Ruoqing smiled and put the bowl and chopsticks in front of him. Li ran to the kitchen and fetched a bowl and chopsticks for her. He said, You haven't eaten either. Sit down and eat with us. Only now did he realize that Rui and Zui Mo went out today. Xiao Huan and Xiao Chui followed them. Mississippi Lu went to Lu Meng and would come back very late. Only he and Ruoqing were left at home. No, Xiao Zhu was also unnecessary. He still had a few scripts to discuss with her. He really shouldn't have wasted time in the yard just now. The dishes cooked by Ruoqing were all his favorites, which made Li Yi feel a little guilty. His taste was similar to Drunk Mo's. Both Ruoqing and Rui liked to eat lighter food. Li Yi put down his bowl and chopsticks and said, "These dishes are not enough for 2 people. I'll make a few more." Ruoqing stood up and said, "What do you want to eat? I'll make it." "No need, no need." Li Yi waved his hand and pressed on her shoulder, asking her to sit down. "I'll do it. I haven't cooked for a long time, and my hands are a little itchy." Ruoqing could only nod helplessly. Soon, Li Yi walked over with a tray. Ruoqing looked at the 3 extra dishes and a soup on the table, and her heart warmed slightly. Then she shook her head and said, "There are so many dishes. The 2 of us can't finish them all. The wine is here." Xiaozhu walked over with an exquisite wine pot in her hand and said, "The grape wine has just been warmed." Ruoqing looked at her and said, "Yuzhu, go to the kitchen and get a set of chopsticks. Come and eat too." Xiaozhu looked at the delicious dishes on the table and secretly swallowed her saliva. She shook her head firmly and said, "It's okay. I'm not hungry. You guys eat." After saying that, she turned and ran away quickly. Li Yi felt that all the maids he had met were very cute. Xiao Huan was like this, Xiao Chui was like this, and Xiao Zhu was also like this. It seemed that he had to care more about them in the future. Such good girls, come eat more of this. Have you noticed that you've lost weight recently? Li Yi first put a lot of dishes in her bowl, and then he started eating himself. At the door of the kitchen, Xiao Zhu held a cold steamed bun in her hands. She fiercely took a bite and stared in a certain direction. Everyone outside is saying that Crown Prince Li Xian was the legitimate prince back then. Ruoqing suddenly raised her head and said while eating. Li nodded and said, "Yes, they're right. But I should call him Crown Prince Li Xian now. They also say that you and the Crown Prince and Princess are the 3 heroes of the capital. It's because of you that the Jing Kingdom has today. That's all nonsense. You can't take it seriously. You can't take it seriously." Ruoqing smiled and said, "In the future, the Crown Prince will supervise the country and the Princess will assist him. What about you? What are your plans?" Li thought for a moment and said, "I don't have any plans. But when that time comes, I won't have to go through so much trouble. I can live a stable life with you for a long time." The words "with you guys" made Ruoqing's face turn slightly red. Wasn't what she yearned for? Wasn't it a peaceful and stable life? Over the past few days, she had turned around to be her best friend and turned around to be the person she loved the most. This was already the most stable and comfortable life she could imagine in her entire life. But why did she have to do all those things? She suddenly lowered her head, bit her lower lip, and said, I have a question to ask you." Li put down his chopsticks and looked at her seriously. Ruoqing was not drunken Mo, nor was she Rui. She did not have so many tricks and thoughts. If she said she had a question to ask him, then there really was a question. She looked into Li Yi's eyes and asked, "What if someone wants to take drunken Mo away and not let you live a stable life? Whoever wants to take drunken Mo, I will break his legs and sink him into the lake of the School of Mathematics. What if their power is very strong? Then I will break all their legs and sink them into the lake of the School of Mathematics. If one lake is not enough, I will dig another in the Academy of Sciences next door. If it is not enough, there is also the Women's College next door. What if that person is Crown Prince Li Xian?" Li Yi looked at her in surprise, and then said, "Why does Li Xian want to take drunken Mo? Although he is the Crown Prince, believe it or not, I can still beat him until even his father can't recognize him." Ruoqing was silent. Li looked at her and asked, "Why? You don't believe me?" Ruoqing smiled, looked up at him, and said, "I believe you." It was not that she didn't believe him, but because she believed him too much. She believed that he could sweep away all the obstacles he encountered. She believed that he had such an ability. She believed that he could do anything for drunken Mo, just as she believed that he could do these things for her. Even if they were facing the entire imperial court, the entire world. It was precisely because she believed that she could not let him do that. Li Yi looked at her clenched fists, and a trace of worry appeared on his face. He asked, "What's wrong with you?" "I'm fine." Ruoqing smiled and said, "It's a pity that drunken Mo is not here." If she heard these words, she would be very happy. Today, Ruoqing was a little strange. Usually, she would not say such strange things. Li could see that she had something on her mind, but since she did not say it, it was useless for him to ask, so he simply did not ask. It was just that in the future, he needed to pay more attention to her. Li brought the warm wine over and poured a glass for her and himself. He said, "It's cold outside. Drink a glass of wine to warm up your body. This is grape wine, so it won't be intoxicating." Ruoqing nodded and raised the glass. Li clinked glasses with her and drank the grape wine in the glass in one gulp. Then he looked at the wine glass in his hand and said doubtfully, "The grape wine today tastes a little strange, but it's quite delicious." Ruoqing only took a shallow sip and did not notice anything. She said, "Maybe it's because it's been warmed." Li nodded and filled his glass again. He had not realized before that after the grape wine was warmed, the taste was even more mellow. In the future, he could drink it warmly. In the kitchen, Xiaozhu finished eating the cold steam bun and poured half a bottle of grape wine in a half a jar of strong wine. She dipped her chopsticks and put it in her mouth, then smacked her lips. Half a bottle of grape wine and half a jar of strong wine tasted quite good. It not only retained the sweet taste of the grape wine, but also made the wine not so strong. This was not a strong wine that intoxicated people, but it was an intoxicating grape wine. In addition, it was not the wine that intoxicated people, but the heart that intoxicated them. There was only so much she could do for them. Chapter 963. It's really strange. Li put down his chopsticks and rubbed his eyebrows. Today, Ruoqing was strange. Even the grape wine was strange. Usually, he didn't feel anything after drinking a whole pot, but today his head began to feel a little dizzy after drinking half a pot. Ruoqing also put down her chopsticks, looked at him, and asked doubtfully, "What's strange?" Li looked at her and asked, "Don't you feel that this wine is a little strange?" Ruoqing shook her head. She only drank 2 cups and didn't feel anything unusual. I'm full. I'll go back to my room and rest for a while." It was nothing to drink poorly, but it was a bit shameful to get drunk after drinking grape wine. Li stood up, but his body couldn't help shaking. Ruoqing hurriedly stood up, supported him, and asked worriedly, "Is there anything wrong with your body?" Li shook his head. "I just feel a little dizzy. I'll be fine after sleep. Let me help you back to your room to rest." Li did feel a little dizzy, but he didn't refuse. In the past, unless he drank the strongest wine, he wouldn't feel this way. Could it be that his insignificant alcohol tolerance was showing signs of regression? Ruoqing helped him back to his room and covered him with a quilt. Then she closed the door and slowly retreated. After cleaning up the mess on the table, when she returned to her room, she found that her door was closed from the inside. "Xiaozhu, are you in there?" No one would enter her room except for herself and Xiaozhu. Xiaozhu liked to sleep on her bed. In the past, when she was reading, she would sleep on her bed if she was bored. After knocking on the door several times, there was still no sound from inside. She thought that she should be asleep, so she didn't disturb her again. The door of Xiaozhu's room was locked from the outside, and the door of Mo's room was the same. She had to walk back to that room again. In Ruoqing's room, Xiaozhu lay on the bed, shaking her legs and murmuring, "Sister, sister, it's up to you next." In Li's room, Ruoqing covered the quilt that had been kicked aside by him and slowly sat down on the bed. She lowered her head to look at this extremely familiar face, and her gaze did not shift for a long time. At the entrance of the mansion, the 2 servants of the Li family bowed and said, "Second, Mississippi." Mississippi Lu walked into the courtyard and went straight to the kitchen. This was a separate kitchen in the courtyard. As usual, she found warm food. There were dishes and wine. She curled her lips. He didn't even know how much he could hold his liquor, yet he drank such a strong liquor. She picked it up and weighed it in her hand. There was only half of it left, enough for him to sleep until tomorrow morning. He picked up his chopsticks and picked up a few mouthfuls of food. Then, he picked up the wine jar and took a gulp. His brows furrowed as he looked at the wine jar in his hand, deep in thought. It wasn't hard liquor. It tasted like grape wine, but not entirely. Surprisingly, it tasted pretty good. After finishing half a jar of wine, Zhang Xian walked out of the kitchen. Seeing that the door was open, he walked over leisurely. At this time, I don't have to go through so much trouble. I can live a stable life with you for a long time. In the room, Ruoqing stared at him for a long time. Thinking of what he had just said, a smile appeared on her face. She slowly reached out and touched his face. What she wanted to live was a stable life with him, Zui Mo, and Xiao Zhu. No one or anything could be an obstacle. She gently held Li Yi's hand. At this moment, the delicate temperament on her body disappeared without a trace. She leaned down and kissed him lightly on the forehead. Then, she stood up and turned around. She turned around and saw Mississippi Lu standing at the door. There was no panic or shame on her face. She walked over unhurriedly and whispered, "He's not feeling well. Let him have a good rest." After that, she walked out of the door. Mississippi Lu looked back and walked into the room. She came to the bed, lowered her head, and sniffed. Her beautiful brows furrowed. Did he think he wouldn't get drunk by mixing grape wine with hard liquor? He wasn't on guard at all. Didn't he know what he looked like when he was drunk? When she saw the light lip mark on his forehead, she was infuriated. In addition to that Zui Mo, there was also Miss Ruoqing, Li Yimingzhu, and she really wanted to cut open his chest and see how his heart was made. Why could it hold so many people? After covering him with the quilt, she was about to turn around and leave when her wrist was suddenly grabbed. "Rui, do you know that I'm very worried about you?" Mississippi Lu turned around and looked at his eyes that were still closed. At this time, she was not worried that he would lie to her. She asked with interest, "Worried about me? Worried that you can't get married?" Li Yi murmured, "Although you are beautiful, your temper is too bad. Which man dares to marry you?" The smile on Mississippi Lu's face became even brighter. "What did you say just now? Say it again." "Don't worry." Li Yi waved his hand casually and said, "If no one wants you in the end, don't forget that you still have me." Her wrist froze, and she suddenly shook off his hand. A trace of panic appeared on her face as she looked down at him. "Don't forget that you still have me. I don't want you either. Ha. Who told you to always beat me?" A trace of pleasure appeared on the face of Li Yi, who was sleeping soundly. Mississippi Lu took a deep breath, turned around, and strode to the door. She did not go out, but closed the door. In the courtyard, Xiao Zhu's eyes widened and the bun in her hand fell to the ground. It's over. Miss, why don't you know how to cherish it? Such a big bargain, and you just gave it to someone else at the brothel." Miss Ruoqing. "Miss, these are the new books I've collected these days. I'll give them to you later." "Sister Ruoqing, last year's accounts, I've put them on your table." Wan Ruoqing nodded and smiled at everyone she met. She passed through the brothel and walked into her room. "Brother Su, ask someone to move these props to the other side." "All right. Brother Su, my wife is going to give birth tonight. I'll have to trouble you to help me after work." "No problem, Brother Wang. Don't worry, I'll be here." Su Zheng was busy inside and outside the hall. A young girl walked in and said, "Brother Su, Sister Ruoqing is looking for you." Su Zheng turned around and smiled. "Got it. I'll be right there." He put down the work in his hands, washed his hands, tidied his clothes, and walked out of the door. He warmly greeted everyone he met along the way. He came to a room and lightly knocked on the door. "Come in." A woman's voice came from inside the room. Su Zheng walked in and closed the door. He respectfully knelt down. "What orders does Her Highness have?" Wan Ruoqing looked at him and asked, "How many followers of the holy religion in the Jing Kingdom?" Su Zheng respectfully replied, "Her Highness, the foundation of the holy religion is in the Qi Kingdom. There are about 100,000 followers, and there are about 10,000 followers in the Jing Kingdom. Among them, there are about 300 elites who stayed in the capital to follow Her Highness. The rest are ordinary followers, and there are about 2,000 of them. The elites of the holy religion? There are more than 300 people. Her Highness, there are more than 300. It's just that most of the elites have followed another Her Highness to the Qi Kingdom. The rest are all developed by me in the past 2 years. Another Her Highness. Wan Ruoqing looked at him and thought for a moment. Then she said, "There's only one Her Highness in the holy religion." Su Zheng was stunned. After a while, he knelt on the ground and said respectfully, "There's only one Her Highness in the holy religion." Chapter 964. Wan Ruoqing stood up, looked at him, and said, "Before you recognize me as your empress, I want to make 3 rules." Su Zheng said respectfully, "Your Highness, please instruct us." First, all the followers of the holy religion are not allowed to kill or do evil. Without any hesitation, Su Zheng nodded and said, "I will definitely pass on Her Highness' teachings to every disciple." Second, you are not allowed to call me empress in public. Su Zheng nodded. "I will inform all the members of the church today." Third, all the followers in the capital must evacuate within 2 days. This time, a look of hesitation appeared on Su Zheng's face. "But, Your Highness, the imperial court is currently investigating the matter of our holy church. If all of our followers are evacuated, what about your safety?" Wan Ruoqing shook her head. "You don't need to worry about my safety. If there is a day when you need to worry, you can't do anything." Su Zheng looked solemn. "Your Highness, you won't go with us?" Wan Ruoqing smiled. "I won't go, Your Highness. If you still recognize me as your empress, do as I say." Su Zheng's face showed an extremely conflicted expression. After a moment, he bowed his head. "I will obey." "What? Still no harvest?" Li Yi took a sip of grape wine, casually asked Li Xian. He looked at the clear wine in the cup, feeling strange. The grape wine that was warmed by others was completely different from the one that Xiao Zhu warmed last time. These days, he tried several methods to warm it, but they were all far from the last time. It seemed that he had to find time to ask Xiao Zhu for advice. "There is no harvest. All the clues are broken." Li Xian was not in a good mood. This was the first case he handled after entering the East Palace. It was of great significance. If he messed it up, the crown prince would lose face. As the left emissary of the holy religion, Li Xian and Li Xian discussed the issues of the holy religion face to face, which made Li Yi feel a little strange. Being a spy to this extent was probably the pinnacle of what a spy could achieve. There were some clues at first, but when we followed the clues, all the people related to it had mysteriously disappeared. All the clues ended there. Li Xian shook his head and said, "It would be great if we could find their empress. She is the most important person in the holy religion." Putting aside the fact that the Taoist nun was currently in the Qi Kingdom, even if she was really in the capital city, ordinary people would not be able to do anything to her. Ruoqing came over and refilled their teacups. In the past, Li Yi did not notice it, but after the busy new year, he found that there seemed to be a shortage of maids in the family. He should recruit a few more. At this time, Uncle Li came in from outside. Li Yi waved to him and said, "Uncle Li, recruit a few more maids in the next 2 days. There are not enough people in the family." Ruoqing thought for a while and suddenly said, "There is no need to go through so much trouble. There are many sisters in the brothel. They are clean and diligent. Why don't I pick a few of them and bring them here?" "That's good." Li Yi nodded. Suddenly, Li Xian thought of something and suddenly said, "Today, the secret intelligence unit caught an ordinary believer of theirs. He was originally a farmer in the suburbs of the capital city. I don't know how he became a believer of the holy religion. I don't know if we can get information about the empress from him." Ruoqing finished pouring tea and left. Li Xian took a sip of tea and stopped talking about the holy religion. He looked back and asked, "Miss Ruoqing, when do you plan to marry her?" Li looked up at him and asked, "What about you? You're going to be the emperor soon, but you only have one empress. How many more do you plan to marry?" Li Xian looked at him with slight disdain. "It is enough for me to have Qin or, unlike you, make a bet. Don't be too confident." Li was waiting for the day when he would slap his own face. "Sure, I am not afraid of you." No one expected that there was such a huge and terrifying force under the feet of the emperor of the capital. Last time, dozens of powerful officials were kidnapped, and the entire upper class of the capital was purged. With great difficulty, they finally settled down and allowed the majority of people to have a good night's sleep. In the blink of an eye, such a thing had happened. Many people, before they went to sleep, worried that someone would set them on fire after they fell asleep, or that someone would slit their throat in their sleep. The officials and nobles of the capital strongly condemned this extremely vile behavior and urged the relevant departments to solve the case as soon as possible so that the capital could see the light of day. The Ministry of Justice, the Secret Intelligence Unit, the Supreme Court, and other departments working together to solve the case were quite efficient. In addition, because the ordinary believers of the holy religion did not have a firm will, the court finally obtained a key piece of evidence: the portrait of the Empress. Whether or not the portrait was similar was not an easy task. In a vast sea of people, finding someone with a portrait was not an easy task. But at least there was a new clue, and this was already a breakthrough. Rui took Zue Mo to attend various occasions, and Mississippi Liu went to Liu Meng. These days, only he and Ruoqing were left at home. When he had nothing to do, he would sometimes play chess with her and discuss the script to kill time. He casually placed a chess piece down and muttered, "It's useless even if we find the portrait. That Taoist nun is now in the Qi Kingdom. Even if we take 10,000 steps back and assume that she's in the Jing Kingdom, we won't be able to capture her unless we send out a few grandmasters at the same time." Not necessarily. Ruoqing shook her head and said, "Maybe their empress is someone else. Besides the Taoist nun, who else was the empress? If Li could get this wrong, wouldn't he have been kidnapped for nothing last time?" Ruoqing put down a chess piece and suddenly looked up at him. She said, "Actually, I have something to hide from you." Li was shocked and asked, "Could it be that you and Zhe Mo really?" Ruoqing looked at him seriously and said, "Actually, I'm the empress they're talking about." Li was relieved. It was not a big deal. He thought that Ruoqing and Zue Mo were hiding it from him. He looked at Ruoqing and said seriously, "Actually, I also have something to hide from you." Ruoqing looked at him. Li looked at her and said slowly, "Actually, I am the left emissary of the holy religion. My status is only below the empress." "I don't even know that you are the empress," he smiled and said. "When did you learn from Zhe Mo? You also like to make this kind of joke." "I'm not joking." Ruoqing shook her head and said, "The holy religion only has the right emissary, not the left emissary." Li put down the chess piece that he had picked up. After a moment of shock, his face showed doubt and disbelief. He asked, "What is going on?" "I don't know either." A trace of helplessness appeared on Ruoqing's face. "I don't know either. How did I become their empress?" Li finally remembered something. It was something that he had almost forgotten. It was the painting that the man in blue showed him when he was brought to Shuzhou by the Taoist nun. "So, the death of Li Jianren and the burning of Prince Xian's residence were all done by them for you?" Ruoqing nodded. Li suddenly smiled and shook his head. He looked at her and said, "As the empress, you don't even know how many emissaries there are in the holy religion." He turned around and opened a cabinet in the room. He took out a jade tablet and walked over to put it on the table. "I'm not joking either." He looked at Ruoqing and knelt on one knee. He said solemnly, "Azure Dragon Emissary Li pays his respects to the empress." Chapter 965. The holy religion only had the right emissary, the white tiger emissary. Although the left emissary, the azure dragon emissary, had a name, there was no such person. This was what Su Zheng told her when he introduced her to the matters of the holy religion. He also told her how to identify the emissaries of the holy religion. She picked up the jade token and looked at it. There were words on the front and a picture of the azure dragon on the back. There was a small dent in the middle. This was undoubtedly the token of the azure dragon emissary of the holy religion. In other words, he did not lie to her. He really was the azure dragon emissary. Before he knew that she was the empress, he was already the azure dragon emissary. She suddenly felt wronged. When she was the happiest and happiest, she inexplicably became the empress of the holy religion. She inexplicably became the wanted criminal of the imperial court. She inexplicably became the main culprit who might implicate him and disrupt their lives. These days, she did not sleep at all. In these days, she made many important decisions in her life. She changed so much that she could not even recognize herself, because she did not know that she was not the only empress in the family. The Azure Dragon, emissary of the holy religion, was also by his side. Why? Why didn't he say so earlier? If she knew that he was the same as her, how could these few days have happened? But the next moment, her heart was filled with joy and happiness. So he was the same as her. They were the same. She was not alone. Looking at Ruoqing, who was stunned and had a complicated expression, Li Yi waved his hand in front of her eyes. Ruoqing, Empress. Ruoqing suddenly looked up at him and said, "I want to bite you." Li Yi was stunned. At this time, Ruoqing had already stood up and walked over. She grabbed his arm and bit down. She did not bite hard, but it was not light either. After a while, she let go. 2 rows of shallow teeth marks appeared on Li Yi's arm. This was not fair. Although he did not tell Ruoqing that he was the Blue Dragon envoy, Ruoqing did not tell him that she was the Empress. Why was she the one who bit him? Forget it. I'll get my revenge later. Let's forget about it for now. We're on the same side anyway. It doesn't matter if he bites my arm or any other place. Li Yi stretched out his other hand and said, "Have you calmed down? Do you want another bite? I can't stay here anymore." This was the first time she had done this to Li Yi. She blushed and lowered her head. "No." Li Yi shook his head without any hesitation. "Let me finish first." Ruoqing looked at him and said, "They have already got my portrait and should recognize me soon. At that time, you and Zumo will not be able to get away from it." Even if His Highness the Crown Prince and the Princess believe you, there are still the civil and military officials in the court and the nobles in the capital. So I must leave. Li Yi smiled and said, "You know, the civil and military officials in the court and the nobles in the capital. I don't care about these things." "I care." Ruoqing looked at him and said seriously, "Believe me, I can handle this matter." "How do you want me to believe you?" Li Yi sighed and said, "If you run far away, where can I find you?" Ruoqing shook her head and said, "I won't run far." "How can I believe you won't run far?" Li Yi shook his head. With his previous understanding of Ruoqing, in order not to affect him, she would definitely run far away. Although he was a little surprised that she told him this time, it was better to be safe than sorry. Ruoqing suddenly took a step forward and gently hugged him. She put her cheek on his chest and whispered, "Because I like you. How can I bear to leave you?" Li Yi's mouth opened slightly, and he was stunned in place. Was this a confession? Not counting that Sundra Lowly, this was the first time in his 2 lives that a member of the opposite sex had taken the initiative to confess. But how could this person be Ruoqing? Shouldn't this kind of trick be used by the domineering female alliance leader or the domineering empress? Could it be that Ruoqing had successfully evolved from a passive, accepting daughter of a humble family to a domineering queen who took the initiative to attack? Li Yi reached out and hugged her. He felt an indescribable pain in his heart. Just what kind of mental journey had she experienced in these past few days for her to change so much? There was no response for a long time. Ruoqing raised her head, and a trace of panic appeared in her eyes. She whispered, "Why aren't you saying anything?" Li Yi lowered his head to look at her and said, "You've said all the things I should have said. What do you want me to say?" Hug. Outside the room, a figure hiding in the bushes clenched the binoculars in his hands and whispered, Kiss, yeah. Success." Li Yi suddenly realized something. The Empress of the Holy Religion was actually Ruoqing. Together with his Blue Dragon ambassador, this holy religion belonged to his family. Ruoqing was a queen, and so was the Taoist nun. It could be considered Tai. The White Tiger ambassador was 1 level lower than him, and his side was slightly better. In this case, why did most of the followers of the holy religion listen to them? This was a bit too much. No one could rob the Li family's things, not even a guru. What belonged to him had to be taken back sooner or later. Su had coveted the Taoist nun for a long time. Judging from the frequency of his second granduncle's abuse, the next time they fought, he would definitely be able to easily teach the Taoist nun a lesson. At that time, wouldn't the great holy religion be at his fingertips? As for what he would do after he got it, that would be a matter for him after he got it. With so many people, it would be convenient to start a rebellion. Of course, the Qi kingdom was too far away from here, so this matter could be discussed later. The most important thing now was that Ruoqing's identity as the Empress was about to be exposed. If he really protected her at the risk of being condemned by the whole world, although it seemed very domineering, it was not the best way. The most important thing was that Ruoqing would not allow him to do that. Li Yi had always trusted her, and this time was no exception. Only now did he realize that this was what she had been worried about these days. He should have asked her earlier. It was not a big deal, and it was a good thing. If it were not for Ruoqing's sudden success in evolution, he would have almost made a fool of himself. Husband, come and carry Dwayner. I want to change my clothes. Rui walked in with Li Duan in her arms and said to him. Li Yi reached out and took Li Duan, who was wearing thick clothes. Rui suddenly looked at his arm in surprise and asked, "What's wrong with your arm, husband? Who bit you?" Li looked down and said, I bit it when I was bored." Rui looked at the row of shallow teeth marks and asked suspiciously, "You bit yourself?" "I really did bite myself." Li Yi picked up Li Duan with one hand and bit his other arm. He said, "Like this, the matter of holy religion was not over yet, so it was better not to complicate things at this time." Li Yi walked out of the door and rubbed his arm. When he bit just now, he had used a little too much force. The second young lady of the Liu clan brushed past him and then turned her head back. She grabbed his arm and asked, "What is this?" Her eyes inadvertently fell on his other arm. She looked at him and asked, "What is this?" Li Yi looked at the teeth marks on his arms and then looked at Mississippi Liu. He said, "You have all been out these days. I was bored at home, so I bit myself. Does it look good?" Mississippi Liu thought for a moment and pointed at the arm that Ruoqing had bitten. She said, "Bite another one for me to see. It's just beside this one. This way, my arms will not be symmetrical." "How ugly." Li Yi shook his head and looked at her. He asked tentatively, "How about I try on your arm?" Chapter 966. If you don't want to try, then don't try. "Why are you looking at me like that?" When she was young, she often left bite marks on her wrist and then used a ballpoint pen to draw on the hands to make it look like a wristwatch. It was normal for her to bite herself. Ignoring the second miss, he walked back to his room and saw Xiao Zhu and Xiao Chui playing in the yard. Li stopped. After some thought, he waved her over. "Xiao Zhu, come here. I want to ask you something." A government office somewhere in the capital. Several officials in charge of the holy religion case were gathered together. They looked at a portrait spread on the table, frowning. Li Xian walked in from outside. He glanced at everyone and asked, "What did you see? Tell me." This case had been dragged on for a long time. It had used up what little patience he had. He was still waiting for the case to end so he could discuss a scientific problem with Shinshu. Speaking of which, it had been a long time since he had seen Shinshu. The Supreme Court official said helplessly, "Your Highness, let's not talk about the authenticity of this portrait for now. It will be difficult for us to find the Empress with just this portrait. This portrait has been plastered all over the streets and alleys of the capital, but we haven't found anything yet." On the other side, Governor Liu Daiyou was deep in thought. He felt that he had seen the Empress in this portrait before, but he couldn't remember where he had seen her before. Annoyed, he picked up the file again and flipped through it. "All right, hurry up." Li Xian waved his hand. Just as he was about to walk out, he glanced at the portrait on the table and stopped. He walked back and looked at the portrait on the table in a daze. Liu Daiyou put down the files of the two cases. As if realizing something, he walked over quickly and looked at the portrait on the table. The next moment, Li Xian put the portrait away. "Your Highness, you..." The officials were confused. "I will take this portrait back and study it carefully. You are dismissed." He waved his hand, picked up the portrait, and left. All of the officials looked at each other in dismay. There is only a single original painting of the Heavenly Empress, and they couldn't even find the person based on the original painting, much less the painter who had copied it. Just what did the Crown Prince want? Lu Dao walked out in a daze. He was thinking about something that he had just figured out. It turned out that Li Jianren's death and the burning of Prince Xian's manor were not unrelated. Li Jianren wanted to harm Miss Ruoqing, so the people of Holy Religion sent him straight to hell. Prince Xian burned down Miss Ruoqing's residence. Therefore, his Prince Xian manor was also burned down by the people from the Holy Religion. These two seemingly unrelated cases were closely linked because of one person. Only, Miss Ruoqing was the Empress. How is this possible? Li Yi took a sip of wine and decided to promote Xiao Zhu to be his personal wine warmer in the future. The grape wine that she warmed tasted different from others. It was at this moment that the slightly absent-minded Li Xian walked in from outside. Li Yi poured him a cup of wine and said, "What's wrong? Isn't Mingzhu the one handling the matters of the court? Why do you look so glum?" After Li Xian sat down, he sighed and handed the portrait to him. Li Yi opened the portrait and stood up abruptly, glaring at him and saying loudly, "Speak. Why is Ruoqing's portrait with you? You already have the crown prince's consort in Shunshu. Could it be that you still have designs on her? Are you still human?" The drawing skills of this portrait were not very good, and ordinary people might not be able to recognize it. However, how could he not recognize it after spending so much time with Ruoqing? Shunshu. Li Xian was startled. "That's not important." Li Yi waved his hand. "Why do you have Ruoqing's portrait?" Li Xian shook his head and looked at him, saying, "This portrait is of the Empress of the Holy Religion." Li looked at the portrait again and asked, "Did you take the wrong one? There are people who look so similar in this world." At this moment, Fong hurriedly ran in from outside and said anxiously, "Son-in-law, bad news. Miss Ruoqing has disappeared." Li Yi was startled. Although Ruoqing did not tell him her plan, he did not need to worry about Ruoqing leaving. Pretending to be surprised, he asked, "What happened?" The people who were protecting Miss Ruoqing were all knocked unconscious. When they woke up, Miss Ruoqing had disappeared. Fong anxiously said, "Son-in-law, don't worry. I have already sent people to look for her." Li, bad news. Xiao Zhu frantically ran out from Ruoqing's room and handed a letter to Li Yi. Wiping away her tears, she said with a sobbing voice, Miss has left." Li Yi opened the letter. In the letter, she explained in detail how she became the Empress. Although this was not her original intention, in order to not implicate him and the Li family, the best way was for her to leave. Li Yi put down the letter and slowly sat down. After Li Xian looked over, his complexion changed. He shook his head and said, I didn't know. If I knew, I wouldn't have let them investigate." Xiao Zhu hugged Li Yi's arm and said with a sobbing voice, "Li, what do we do? What do we do now?" A servant of the Li family came over and said in a low voice, "Marquis, a lord from the Ministry of Justice has come to visit." Li Yi waved his hand. "Let him in." "Greetings to your highness. Greetings to Lord Li." An official from the Ministry of Justice came in and respectfully bowed. Li Xian was annoyed. He glanced at him and asked, "What's the matter?" The official looked up and said in a low voice, "Your Highness, our people have just found the identity of the woman in the portrait. However, the Empress and County Marquis Li." "What do you mean?" Li Xian said coldly with a sullen face. "What are you people from the Ministry of Justice doing? If he says it's the Empress, then it's the Empress. Can't you use your brain to think about it? Go back and investigate it seriously." After being scolded by the Crown Prince, the official from the Ministry of Justice could only nod his head in agreement and leave helplessly. Li Xian looked at Li Yi and said worriedly, "Don't worry, I will order people to find Miss Ruoqing." Li Yi waved his hand. "No need. In any case, she is the Empress of the Holy Religion." No. Li Xian shook his head repeatedly. "Didn't you say last time that the Empress of the Holy Religion is that Taoist nun? How can there be two empresses? What happened to Miss Ruoqing was a misunderstanding. I will order the Taoist nun to be wanted in the whole Jing kingdom." Li Yi shook his head and said no more. Li Xian said solemnly, "I will go back and order it now." Li Xian still had a worried look on his face when he left the Li residence. At this time, the Holy Religion was not the thing he was worried about. Miss Ruoqing had left. According to Li Yi's character, he would not let it go. If he left with her, There would be no meaning in the capital, in the yard. Fong looked at Li Yi, who was calmly drinking grape wine, and asked, "Young master, Miss Ruoqing is the empress of the holy religion. Aren't you surprised?" Putting aside the fact that Miss Ruoqing had suddenly become the empress, she had disappeared just like that. Young master's reaction should not be like this. So what if Ruoqing is the empress? Li looked at him and said, "I'm also the Azure Dragon Envoy of the holy religion. Have I ever shown off before?" The matter regarding the holy religion, which had caused a great commotion in the past few days, had yet to subside when another wave of commotion broke out in the capital. Prince Xian, who had already left the capital, had met with a group of thugs on his way to his feudal land. Not only had his group been robbed, but even Prince Xian had been beaten up by them. Therefore, Prince Xian, who had just left the capital, was carried back again. It was verified that the group of thugs were the believers of the holy religion. Although Prince Xian had met with an unexpected misfortune, those people had at least left the capital. While strict orders were given to investigate those thugs, all the influential officials in the capital were finally at ease. They had finally left. As for whether the empress of the holy religion was the Taoist nun who was wanted or someone else, or whether she was related to County Marquis Li, the imperial court had not come to a conclusion. They could not tell if it was real or fake either. However, since the crown prince and the princess did not care, they could not say anything else. It was fine as long as they were no longer threatened by those people in the future. Although the Ministry of Justice and the other government offices had investigated some things, they were unable to verify that the lady had disappeared from the capital. The crown prince had the intention to close the case and had even given them a death order. To them, this was also a good thing. Who would dare to go to County Marquis Li's place to investigate the case? Li Manor. Drunken Imo looked at Li Yi and asked with a burning gaze, "Where on earth did Sister Ruoqing go?" Li shook his head and said, "I really don't know. A few days ago, her portrait was pasted all over the capital. She definitely can't appear now. You must know something." Drunken Mo's expression was one of disbelief. She shook her head and said, "If Sister Ruoqing really went missing, you'll go crazy from anxiety. How would you be in a mood to drink grape wine here? Look into my sincere eyes." Li Yi held her face and looked at her, saying, "I'm not lying to you. I really don't know where she is." Drunken Mo pushed his hand away, feeling less nervous. Although she was still very curious as to why Sister Ruoqing had become the empress, what was more important was that she was safe and sound. It was because if something were to really happen to her, a certain someone would be much more anxious than her. Li Yi saw Uncle Li walking past in a hurry and asked, "Uncle Li, where are you going?" Caretaker Li came back and stood at the door, saying, "Didn't young master say that there's a lack of manpower at home and that you need to pick a few more maids?" Miss Ruoqing picked a few from the brothel. "Now that they're all here, I'll go take a look." Chapter 9:67. Compared with powerful officials of the same level, the Li family did not have many servants. This was because all the masters in the family did not have the habit of having servants serve them. However, there were still maids who were responsible for cleaning the room and serving tea to the guests. Ever since Zumo and Ruoqing moved in, the family seemed to be lacking in manpower. Before Ruoqing left, he picked a few diligent sisters from the brothel who had clean backgrounds. He knew them well and did not have to worry about anything else. Butler Li stood in the yard and looked at the few women standing in a row. He said solemnly, "This is the marquis of our family. Open your eyes and look carefully. Don't mistake the master in the future. I will take you to see Madam later." He didn't usually scold the servant girls. Uncle Li was the one who played the role of the bad guy. In his words, servants should act like servants. Even if the master was benevolent, the servants couldn't know what was good for them. The new maids needed to establish their authority. After saying this with a straight face, Uncle Li waved his hand and said, "Okay, starting from the far left, introduce yourselves one by one." "My name is Xiao Qiu," a maid said timidly. "My name is Xiao Rong." Another maid stood up. "I am Xiao Ro." I am Xiao Dai." There were a total of 5 maids who entered the mansion this time. They would be taken to see Rui and Zumo later. Li Yi's gaze swept over them and moved to the last woman in white. The woman smiled and bowed slightly to him. Xiao Qing greets the Marquis. Uncle Li turned around and said with a smile, "Young master, I will take them to see Madam and second Madam. Wait, I still lack someone to grind ink in my study." Li Yi thought for a moment and looked at the maids again. He pointed casually and said, "Xiao Qing." Uncle Li looked at him in surprise. Young master's study had long been taken over by the second miss, and the thing he usually did was bask in the sun in the courtyard. It was understandable that he lacked a servant girl to massage his shoulders and legs, but what kind of ink was he grinding for? However, the entire Li family was his. It was naturally not a problem to have a maid. Uncle Li looked at her and said, "Xiao Qing, then you will follow the Marquis from now on." The woman lowered her head and bowed again. Yes. This winter, it was likely that it would not snow at all. As the Lantern Festival approached, the weather began to warm up. By noon, there was not much chill. Yongning and Shawnee took off their thick fur coats and played on the lawn. Li Yi sat to the side and leisurely roasted meat. The two finally got tired of playing and ran over to crouch beside Li Yi. They swallowed as they watched the golden oil drip onto the charcoal, making a sizzling sound. This is not normal. This is definitely not normal. Li Xian stood far away and looked at this scene. The worry on his face deepened. And Mingzu turned to look at him and asked, "How is it not normal? Miss Ruoqing has disappeared for 3 whole days." Li Xian counted with his fingers and looked at Li Yi. How can he be so calm and still have the mood to sit there and roast meat, and still have a mood to feed Shawnee? Is this not good? And Mingzu looked at him and asked, "Do you want him to be depressed?" Li Xian shook his head and said, "Have you heard an old saying?" "What old saying?" And Mingzu looked at him and asked, "What old saying?" Li Xian said in a low voice, "If you don't explode in silence, you will perish in silence." And Mingzu looked at him in confusion. Which ancient person said this? Lu Sun. Who is Lu Sun? The writer, thinker, and educator that Li Yi mentioned last time. Don't worry about who Lu Sun is. Li Xian shook his head and said, "Don't be fooled by his smile on the surface. Maybe in his heart. In short, he is very dangerous. The calmer he appears, the more dangerous he is. Then what is normal for him to do? Look for him," Li Xian said anxiously. "He should be more anxious than anyone else. He's been looking for you all over the world. It's impossible for him to be as calm as he is now. Think about it. If you are lost, what will he do? When you go there later, don't mention Miss Ruoqing, and don't mention holy religion," Li Xian said, and then walked quickly. "Let me do it." Li Xian snatched the iron skewer from Li Yi's hand and said, "You rest. I will roast it for a while." He didn't expect the crown prince to be so diligent. Li Yi handed the iron skewer to him and took a chicken wing for himself. Just now, he was focused on feeding the 2 greedy cats and didn't eat much. "Put it down and don't move." Li Xian snatched the iron skewer from his hand and put the chicken wing on the plate with chopsticks. He said, "It's more convenient to eat like this." Li looked at him and suddenly asked, "Do you have something to ask of me?" Li Xian shook his head violently. "No, really, you only have this one chance." "I really don't." Li Yi shook his head. He didn't know what was wrong with him today. Just in case, it was better to stay away from him. After eating the chicken wing, he walked straight to the pavilion in the middle of the lake. The weather was good today. On his way back, he would catch 2 fish, one in soup and one in braising. Li Xian finished roasting the fish. When he turned around, he found that Li Yi was no longer by his side. He looked back and said in shock, "Mingzu, stop him. He wants to jump into the lake." "This is why I changed my clothes when I came back," he explained to Rui, Mississippi Lou, and Drunk Ink. After all, the clothes he wore when he came back were different from when he went out. It was Mingzhu's clothes. It would indeed cause a big misunderstanding. Those who didn't know better would think that he had done something dirty. It was just that when he was fishing, he subconsciously dodged Mingzhu's grasp. In the end, the fish ran away, and he fell into the lake. The lake water at this time of year was piercingly cold. If it weren't for Imingzu bringing him a new set of clothes from the women's college next door, he would probably be frozen sick today. Of course, many of her clothes were gender-neutral, so he didn't look so out of place when he wore them. Although he had changed his clothes, he still looked a little disheveled. Rui helped him take off his coat and said, "I've asked Xiao Huan to boil the water. Husband, go take a hot bath first." The lake water was dirty. It was time for a good bath. Although he was wearing Mingzhu's clothes on the outside, his underwear was still wet. Soaking comfortably in the bathtub, the water vapor rose. Li Yi closed his eyes, and the remaining chill immediately disappeared. The door creaked and slowly closed. Someone added hot water to the bathtub. Li Yi said, "Let me massage my shoulders." The figure who was about to walk out of the door stopped in his tracks. Not long after, a pair of soft hands were placed on his shoulders. The hands moved slowly on his shoulders. At a certain moment, Li Yi said, "Xiao Huan, you don't need to massage here. Just massage the previous place." I don't know where Miss Xiao Huan used to massage before. Hearing the voice behind him, Li Yi opened his eyes and turned his head. He said in surprise, "Xiao Qing, why are you here?" The woman behind him smiled a little embarrassedly. "Duaner was making a fuss. Xiao Huan went to comfort him and asked me to come and add water for her." Chapter 968. Xiao Huan, what's wrong? Did someone bully you? Xiao Huan had been listless for the past 2 days. Today, in half a day, Li Yi found that she was in a daze 3 times. When she sat alone at the stone table in the courtyard, Li Yi walked over and sat opposite her, asking with concern. No, Xiao Huan shook her head. She could not say that it was because the servant girl called Xiao Qing was too diligent and took away all the work that was supposed to be done by her. Moreover, the son-in-law seemed to treat that Miss Xiao Qing differently. This was the first time he allowed another servant girl to grind the ink for him, and also the first time he allowed another servant girl to rub his shoulders when he was bathing. These things were all done by her in the past. Li looked at her and said in disbelief, "Really?" The servant girl twisted her fingers together and looked at him pitifully. She asked, "Son-in-law, do you not like Xiao Huan anymore?" Li Yi did not know what the servant girl was thinking. Surprised, he got up and sat beside her. Pinching her face, he asked, "Who said that? Who said son-in-law doesn't like Xiao Huan?" The servant girl said pitifully, "But son-in-law doesn't need Xiao Huan to grind the ink. He doesn't need Xiao Huan to bathe." Li Yi then knew that she was actually jealous of Ruoqing. Ruoqing's identity as the Empress of Heaven had already been exposed. Although Li Xian did not let those people investigate further, but if she appeared in the capital with her original appearance, there would still be some trouble. So she ordered most of the followers of the holy religion to leave the capital, creating the illusion that the Empress of Heaven had already left the capital. Then, she disguised herself as a servant girl and came back without anyone knowing. Not to mention the other things of the holy religion, but the level of disguise, Li Yi himself had a deep understanding. With a mask on, even one's own parents would not be able to recognize it. Of course, he couldn't be more familiar with Ruoqing. This familiarity didn't just come from her face. On the first day he entered the mansion, he had recognized her at first sight. Knowing that she was Ruoqing, she naturally could not treat her like an ordinary servant girl, so she specially arranged for her to stay by her side and arranged a room for her alone. Who would have thought that such a little difference would actually be discovered by Xiao Huan? Li Yi pulled her over and asked with a smile, "Are you jealous of little Qing?" The little maid sniffled. "Of course not." Li Yi leaned close to her ear and whispered a few words. Xiao Huan's eyes suddenly widened. She said in disbelief, "How is this possible? How could Xiao Qing be? Have you forgotten that the son-in-law also has a mask like that?" Xiao Huan was startled. Her face revealed a look of realization, and then she became a little embarrassed. If little Qing was Miss Ruoqing, then it wouldn't be a problem. Why would it be a problem if it was Miss Ruoqing? Even she couldn't understand it herself. If he didn't explain it clearly to Xiao Huan, who knew what she would think. The Li family was so big, and there were so many people. This matter, Li didn't even have the time to tell Rui. If he showed any abnormalities, Ruoqing's efforts would be in vain. Second madam, what's the matter? The new servant girl of the Li family walked into a room and asked the woman in the room. Drunk Ink looked up at her and said, "It's nothing much. I heard that little Qing is good at grinding ink. I was just about to write a few words and wanted to ask for your help." Little Qing walked to the desk and said with a faint smile, "This is what I should do." There were not only the two of them in the room. When she was grinding ink, little Zhu sat on the other side of the desk with one hand on her chin, murmuring, "Where did Sister Ruoqing go?" Little Chui jeered at the side. "It must be that Sister Ruoqing thinks you are too annoying and doesn't want you anymore." "Say it again." "What's wrong with saying it again?" "You are just annoying." The two little servant girls quickly began to quarrel. Drunk Ink ignored them and looked at little Qing, who was grinding ink. She asked, "Where is little Qing from?" "She grew up in the capital." Drunk Ink shook her head and said, "Little Qing is very much like a good friend of mine, but she grew up in Qing, in prefecture, and only came to the capital 2 years ago." Little Qing smiled and did not speak. Drunk Ink asked again, "Who else is in the family?" Little Qing replied, "Only me." The two of them chatted like this. Not long after, Little Qing put down the ink and said, "Second madam, the ink is ready. If there is nothing else, I'll go down first." Drunk Ink crossed her arms and looked at her, asking, "How long are you going to pretend for?" Little Qing looked surprised and asked, "Second madam, what are you talking about?" Drunk Ink suddenly hugged her and put her hands on her chest. "This is the feeling. Do you still want to pretend?" Ruoqing's face was red and she hurriedly said, "Drunk Ink, what are you doing? Let go of me." At this moment, her voice was very different from before. "Not calling me second madam now?" Drunk Ink looked at her with a proud expression and said, "Little Chui, close the door." Hearing the young Mrs. order, Little Chui immediately ran over and closed the door. Ruoqing's expression finally became flustered and she hurriedly said, "Drunk Ink, what are you going to do? Don't do anything stupid." Drunk Ink looked at her and snorted. "You even dare to lie to me. Of course you will be punished according to the family rules." Hearing the words family rules, Ruoqing's face became even redder. She looked at little Zhu and said anxiously, "Yuzhu, come help me." Little Zhu rolled up her sleeves and ran over, asking excitedly, "Sister Drunk Ink, how do you want me to help you?" Ever since Li Duan could walk steadily, he liked to walk, and Rui did not have to watch him all the time. Now, it was approaching the Lantern Festival. For the Li family, the most important day of this month was not the Lantern Festival, but the happy event of welcoming Drunk Ink into the family at the end of the month. Rui handed over a booklet and said, "This is the guest list written by old madam. Husband, take a look and see if anyone is missing. It's time to have someone write an invitation. Old madam is familiar with this kind of thing. I don't think she will miss anyone." Li Yi looked at it and put it aside. Rui looked at him and asked again, "Miss Ruoqing is gone. Husband, are you really not going to look for her?" Li Yi was actually about to tell her about this matter, but he did not expect Rui to speak first. He said awkwardly, "You may not know, but actually, little Qing is Miss Ruoqing." Unlike what Li Yi had imagined, Rui's face did not show much surprise. She looked at Li Yi and said with a smile, "I thought husband would hide this matter from me for a few more days." Li Yi said in surprise, "Wife, you know all about it. There are many ways to tell a person apart from their appearance. Figure, behavior, aura." Rui looked at him and said, "Judging people by their appearance is the worst way." Li Yi explained, "Ruoqing's identity is special. If others know, it will be troublesome. I don't blame husband. I know all this." Rui leaned on his shoulder and asked softly, "But I don't know how many good sisters I have." Li Yi said in surprise, "Wife, don't you only have one sister, Rui?" "Including Xiao Huan, there are only 2. Rui shook her head and said, "Other than Rui and Xiao Huan, there are also Sister Zumo, Sister Ruoqing, Sister Mingzhu, and Sister Lin from the Qi Kingdom. It depends on husband whether there are any Sister Lin." Li Yi shuddered. He thought that spring was coming, but at this moment, he felt that the weather was getting colder and colder. The weather was getting colder. keep warm, and avoid catching a cold. Chapter 969. Never underestimate a woman. If she had the identity of a grandmaster in addition to being a woman, then she should not be underestimated even more. This was what Li Yi had learned from his own experience. In fact, I have long known about Miss Ruoqing's feelings for my husband. Rui leaned against his chest and said, "In the past few years, from Qing and prefecture to the capital, such a large brothel has been taken care of by a woman. I can imagine how hard she has worked. If it were not for the fact that she already loves my husband to the bone, which woman would be willing to do this for a man? She does not want to be the empress who is respected by all. She only wants to be the little Qing who follows my husband. How can I not see it? There are not many women in the world who value affection and righteousness so much, but my husband has met all of them. Why is my husband so lucky? I want to bite you." Ruoqing's identity was no longer a secret to Rui and the others. But in the mansion, she still called herself Little Qing and did all the things that a servant girl should do. After all, her other identity was a little too shocking. There was a bite mark of love on his neck in exchange for Rui's acknowledgement of Ruoqing. No matter how broad-minded Rui was, it was impossible for her to remain calm from beginning to end in this kind of thing. So when she proposed that good things come in pairs and let drunken Mo and Ruoqing enter the Li family at the same time, he did not agree. It was better to take this matter step by step. While eating, Mississippi Lu, who was sitting next to him, glanced at him and asked, "What's wrong with your neck?" Drunken Mo also looked over with a puzzled expression. Li Yi looked at Rui. Rui's pretty face was slightly red. She lowered her head and bit her chopsticks, and at the same time gave him a threatening look. Li Yi swallowed the words he was about to say. Rui's threat was much more useful than Mississippi Lu's. Before Zue Mo and Ruoqing married into the Li family openly, ignoring Rui's threat, he could only stay alone in the room at night. He would rather offend Mississippi Lu than Rui. He picked up a mouthful of food, touched the bite mark on his neck, and said casually, "Oh, you mean this? I had nothing better to do, so I bit it randomly." Xiao Huan put down her chopsticks and twisted her head to see if she could bite her own neck. Mississippi Lu also put down her chopsticks and looked at him with her arms crossed. "Take another bite and we'll see." Li Yi asked in surprise here. Mississippi Lu nodded. "Right here." Li Yi thought about it and said, "All right then." Seeing this, Xiao Huan immediately turned her head, wanting to see how her son-in-law could do this action that she could not do. Li Yi rinsed his mouth and then looked at Mississippi Lu. To be precise, he stared at her snow-white neck and asked, "Have you washed your neck?" Too many things had happened in the 4th year of Jinghe. The fall of the Chui family, the loss of power of the king of Shu, and a large number of forces in the capital had suffered a bloody purge. Some families fell, and others stood up. The current situation in the capital, and even in the Jing kingdom, had been very stable. The people's hearts and the imperial court had stabilized. Although Li Xian had just succeeded the throne, he had a high reputation in the imperial court. With Mingzhu's assistance, he could easily stabilize the general situation. From the moment they stepped here, the turbulent capital began to calm down. After observing for several days, Li Xian finally confirmed that the incident did not seem to have much effect on Li Yi. Not only that, the entire Li family seemed to be exactly the same as before. Even the servant girl, called Xiao Zhu, did not seem to feel anything about her mistress's departure. When she brought the wine over, she was smiling like a flower. This made him feel relieved, but also puzzled. Based on his understanding of Li Yi, he could not be so calm at this time. Li Xian looked at him and asked suspiciously, "Did you hide Miss Ruoqing?" Li drank a cup of warm grape wine and shook his head. "No." Li Xian looked at the servant girl who was pouring wine for Li Yi and suddenly said in surprise, "Your servant girl looks unfamiliar. Is she new?" He waved his hand and said, "Don't just look at the marquee. I've run out of wine. Why don't you pour it?" "Pour what?" Li Yi slapped the table and glared at him. "If you want a drink, pour it yourself. Don't you have hands?" Li Xian looked at him in a daze, and then looked at the servant girl standing to the side. A thoughtful expression appeared on his face. After a moment, he stared at Li Yi. You even hid it from me? Li Yi poured more wine for him. If other people knew, you would be the one in trouble. But you're watching. Is she really the empress of the holy religion? The dissatisfaction on Li Xian's face instantly disappeared. He asked with some excitement, Is it like what she said in the letter? Correct. Li Yi nodded. Tell me, is there such a possibility? Li Xian looked at him, thought for a moment, and said, Now there are two empresses of the holy religion. If we make Taoist none, he made a throat-slitting gesture and murmured, then this holy religion can be used by us. Didn't you say that the holy religion has 100,000 believers in the Qi kingdom? When the time comes, we can work together. That being said, Taoist nun was a grandmaster. Even if she couldn't beat them, she could still run. Moreover, she was in the Qi kingdom, surrounded by followers, and there were many masters among them. If they really fought force with force, the current Lu Meng would not be a match for her. It would not be easy to deal with her. It was slightly more difficult. Li Yi did not accompany Li Xian in his daydreaming. He asked, How is His Majesty's health? The winter this year was unusually cold. The weather had been good for a few days, but it became gloomy again. It would not warm up before the Lantern Festival. In the past, when the weather was good, he could occasionally go to the palace to get a free meal. Now it had been a long time since he was summoned. Li Xian drank up the wine in his cup, shook his head, and said, Father now spends more time in sleep than when he is awake. The old emperor's illness worsened with the seasons, and it was getting worse year by year. This winter was long and cold, and there was no sign of it warming up. He, Li Xian, and Mingzu had tried to avoid this topic. What did the imperial doctors say? If he can survive this winter, there may be some relief, but if, before Li Xian finished his words, he fell in his silence. He looked up at the sky. It was gloomy, as if the whole sky was about to press down, making it difficult to breathe. Your Highness, His Majesty summons you. A eunuch came in from outside and said respectfully, Marquis Li, His Majesty also summons you. Chapter 970. His Majesty has just woken up and is talking with Her Highness the Empress and Her Highness the Consort Yin in the hall. Wait in the side hall for a while, Changda said to Li Yi and Li Xian as he closed the door. Li Xian let out a breath and rubbed his hands together. He walked into the side hall and asked, How many times has Father woken up today? Changda said, Today is the second time. He woke up for a while in the morning and went back to sleep after eating some food. After walking into the side hall, they could no longer feel the cold air outside. Yongning saw Li Yi and ran over. She accidentally tripped and fell to the ground. Li Yi quickly ran over and picked her up. He asked with concern, Are you hurt? Although tears were already welling up in her eyes, she still shook her head and said in a soft voice, It's not painful. Li Yi patted away the dust on her body and held her little hand. He said, Be careful when you walk in the future, okay? Yongning lowered her head and said obediently, I know. Not only was Yongning in the side hall, but Mingzu and Shaning were also there. There were also a few young princes and princesses playing in the distance. Teacher, what's wrong with Father? The proud Lolita slowly raised her head and looked at Li Yi. There was a trace of unconcealable panic in the depths of her clear eyes. Li Yi patted her head and said, His Majesty is fine. He just wants to talk to you. Don't you have many things to say to your father? Li looked at Mingzu. She was sitting there with a dazed expression and her eyes were out of focus. A eunuch walked in and said softly, Your Highness the Crown Prince, eldest princess, His Majesty summons you. Li Xian and Mingzu brought Yongning, Shaning, and the group of princes and princesses into the hall. Li Yi sat alone in the side hall, staring blankly at the dancing flames in the furnace. It was quiet in the side hall. Only the crackling sound of the firewood in the stove could be heard. Li Yi's heart was also peaceful. It was so peaceful that he couldn't even hear the only sound. He had already vaguely guessed some things. After an unknown amount of time, perhaps a quarter of an hour, or perhaps an hour, Li Xian's voice rang in his ears. Li looked up at him and realized that Mingzu, Yongning, and Shaning were already standing in front of him. Li Xian's eyes were a little red as he said in a low voice, "Father wants you to go." Li Yi nodded, stood up, and walked out of the side hall. The cold wind blew against his face. He tightened his clothes. Chanda had already opened another door and said, "Come in." When Li walked into the hall, the first thing he smelled was a faint fragrance. The fragrance of white fungus and lotus seed soup. He slowly walked to the bed and bowed. "This official greets, cough, no need." A weak voice came from the bed. Emperor Jing leaned on the bed, looked at him, and asked, "Have you eaten?" "Not yet." Li Yi shook his head. It was not time to eat at this time. Emperor Jing tilted his head to look and gestured. "Then eat here." Chanda, help Shin up. A bowl of white fungus and lotus seed soup that had been cooked too well, and a few simple side dishes. Although they were simple, it was very intimate. In the early years of Jing He, in Ning Wang Fu, there were also these few side dishes and a bowl of white fungus and lotus seed soup that had been cooked too well. Zhen still remember that day when you said that you had a stubborn disease that prevented you from being an official. A eunuch at the side wanted to pick up the spoon for him. Emperor Jing waved his hand with difficulty and picked up the spoon himself. He said, "Why did Jin not punish you for deceiving the emperor at that time?" Li Yi took a sip of the soup and shook his head. He smiled and said, "One who does not know is not guilty. Moreover, if your majesty had deceived the emperor at that time, no one would have saved your majesty that night. Everything is fate." Emperor Jing nodded and said with a smile, "Pour wine for Zhen." Li poured himself a cup of grape wine and shook his head. He said, "Your majesty, you have forgotten that you cannot drink wine." He took a sip of wine. Emperor Jing suddenly looked at him and asked, "Are you not afraid that the wine is poisoned?" Li Yi shook his head and said, "If your majesty wanted to poison the wine, why did you wait until today?" Emperor Jing nodded and said, "Yes, if I wanted to poison the wine, after you offered Tianfa, after you used the brothel to spread rumors to force the king of Shu to leave the capital, after you gathered the people in the martial arts world, after you used a play to destroy the literary family of the Jing kingdom, after you got rid of the Cui family, and when you wanted to help Mingzu ascend the throne, I would have done it." Li drank the wine in his cup and shook his head. He said, "Tianfa was what your majesty wanted. The king of Shu left the capital was also what your majesty wanted. The one who wanted to destroy the Chu family was your majesty. The one who wanted to get rid of the Cui family and support Mingzu was your majesty. I will not take the blame for this." Emperor Jing looked at him and said slowly, "In the end, you did not let Jin down." Li Yi cupped his hands and said, "Thank you for your trust, your majesty." Emperor Jing put down his chopsticks and covered his chest. After a long pause, he said, "Zhen will leave soon." His tone was very calm and his expression was indifferent. It was as if he was saying something very ordinary. It was as if he was saying that he would be back soon. Just like just now, he casually asked Li Yi, "Have you eaten?" Li hoped that was the case. Emperor Jing looked at Li Yi and suddenly asked, "You know everything. Can you tell Zhen where people go after they die? Is there really an underworld?" There was no fear on his face, only curiosity. "I don't know whether there is an underworld or not." Li shook his head and said, "But sometimes death is not the end, but the beginning." "What do you mean?" "It is possible that when your majesty wakes up, you will find that you are no longer in the imperial palace, not in the Jing kingdom, but in the Qi kingdom, in the Wu kingdom, or in another world. At that time, your majesty will not be like this. Perhaps you are just a baby, a naughty child, or a young man." Li looked at Emperor Jing and said, "It seems difficult to understand, but a few years ago, your majesty certainly did not think that anyone could fly to the sky, right?" Emperor Jing looked at him and asked, "You mean fly to the sky like those people in the Academy of Sciences?" Li shook his head and said, "They can only fly a little more than 10 feet, at most a few hundred feet. I said that people can fly thousands of feet, tens of thousands of feet, and even to the moon. At that time, from the capital to the Qi kingdom, It will not take several months, but only 1 to 4 hours. Mere mortals can also fly to the moon. Not only that, but if the sun is not too hot, mortals can even fly to the sun. Your Majesty can imagine that in the distant future, a celestial punishment can raze the entire capital to the ground, making the capital region barren for 100 years. Your Majesty may also not imagine that there is a heavenly eye that allows your Majesty to see what is happening in any place in the Jing Kingdom from the Imperial Palace. Your Majesty certainly can't imagine that one day I can send a message to your Majesty from the Qi Kingdom. There is no courier station, no messenger, and the message arrives in an instant. If your Majesty wants to destroy the capital of the Qi Kingdom, you don't need to mobilize a large number of people. You only need to sit in the Yangju Hall and move your finger. The eunuchs standing on both sides, including Changde, had their mouths wide open. A celestial punishment could destroy the entire capital. Mortals could fly to the moon and see the entire Jing Kingdom's heavenly eye. Even from 1,000 miles away, the message arrived in an instant. Did County Marquis Li have a hysteria again? If someone else told me this, I would send him to the Imperial Physician Bureau. Emperor Jing looked at him and said, "You are different. I don't trust others, but I trust you. It's a pity that I won't be able to see this day." He sighed with regret on his face. Then he said, "Changde, call Xian and Mingzu to come here." Changde walked out of the hall. He turned around and took out a small wine pot from a quilt. He smiled and said, "Shanning understands me the best." He poured a cup of wine for himself. Li did not stop him. Emperor Jing took a sip and closed his eyes. After a while, he slowly opened his eyes and said, "After I leave, please take care of Mingzu and Xian." Li Xian and Mingzu walked in. Emperor Jing slowly stood up and held their hands. Then he looked at Li Yi and said with a smile, "I hand over the world to you." Chapter 971. Today was the 15th day of the first lunar month. The capital was getting more and more prosperous every year. It was just past noon, but the streets in the city were already crowded. The Li family. Xiao Huan poked her head out of the kitchen and said, "Young master, I want to eat sesame filling." Second Miss also wants to eat sesame filling. The small kitchen was not big to begin with. Li Yi was making yuan xiao. Ruoqing was helping by the side. The proud Lolita was helping on the other side, and Yongning was running around. The place was a bit crowded. Even if the others wanted to help, they could not come in. Li Yi waved his hand to indicate that he understood. Yongning approached Li Yi and said sweetly, "Brother, Cindy wants to eat sugar filling." Li Yi's hands were full of glutinous rice flour. He tapped the tip of her nose and said, "You can only eat 2 sugar filling. If you have cavities, it will be very painful." Yongning thought about it and looked up at him. She held out 3 fingers and said, "How about 3? Looking at her pitiful look, Li Yi could only nod. "3 it is, no more, okay." Yongning nodded her head forcefully. Worried that Li Yi would go back on his words, she hurriedly ran to Shanning's side and stared with wide eyes. The proud Lolita was holding a small sieve and shaking it. Inside the sieve were yuan xiao and glutinous rice flour. The yuan xiao shaken this way was round and round. She was never tired of this work. After shaking for a while, she slowly walked over and looked at Li Yi. She said, "Sir, can you make some bean paste filling? I will bring it to Father when I return to the palace in the afternoon. Father loves to eat bean paste filling the most." Li Yi smiled at her and said, "Sister Xiaoqing is already preparing the filling. We will make it together later." The proud Lolita immediately became happy. Yongning walked to her side and looked at the small sieve in her hand. She whispered, "Sister, can I play with this?" Yuan xiao was to be eaten in the evening. It was still early. The 15th day of the first lunar month was the busiest day of the year in the capital city. Yongning and Shanning spent most of their time in the palace. They had to go back at night, so they couldn't miss this opportunity. After lunch, Li Yi took the 2 of them to the street. Compared to the crowds at night, it was much better during the day because the lantern show, fireworks, and other important events would only start at night. On the street, There were vendors selling all kinds of snacks, street acrobatics, and all kinds of mechanical gadgets. The two young ladies could not take it all in. Lee looked at the bustling crowd, the row upon row of shops, and the endless stream of hawkers on the street. He deeply felt that in these 2 years, the capital had changed a lot. He bought a sugar figurine for Yongning and Shouning that represented their zodiac signs and casually asked the old sugar figurine seller, "Sir, how's business today?" The old man grinned and said, "Business is good. In the past, it would take a day to sell, but today it's all sold out in an hour." Lee looked at the sugar figurine in their hands and said with a smile, "Sir, your skill is good. The sugar figurine is so lifelike. It's not surprising that business is good. I think life at home must be good." The old man shook his head and said, "This old man has been selling sugar figurines all his life. It's only in the past 2 years that life has gotten better. If it weren't for His Majesty's compassion for people like us and reducing taxes 3 times, I'm afraid I would have frozen to death at home in the winter of the year before last." The shop assistant at the tea stall next to him curled his lips and said, "Old Zhang, you're still acting pitiful here." This year, a sugar figurine seller built new houses for his 2 sons and married new wives. Next year, your sugar figurine shop will be opening soon. Tell me, what's there to cry about? The old man frowned and said discontentedly, "This old man has this year because of His Majesty's benevolent policy. It's not like I haven't experienced hard times. But Wang irks you, you brat. You got a good policy from the beginning." After the proud Lolita finished eating the sugar figurine, she licked her rosy lips and shook Li Yi's arm. She said, "Sir, I want more." Li looked at Yongning on the other side and found that she was also looking at him eagerly. He nodded and looked at the old man selling sugar figurines. He said, "Sir, 2 more please." The old man took out 2 more sugar figurines. When Li Yi paid, he waved his hand and looked at Yongning and Shawning. He said with a smile, "Little girl, you're so handsome. Today is a good day. I'll give these 2 sugar figurines to them." Li Yi handed the sugar figurines to them and said, "Hurry up and thank the old grandpa." "Thank you, old grandpa. Thank you, old grandpa," the 2 young girls said obediently. The wrinkles on the old man's face smoothed out like a blooming chrysanthemum. Li Yi held the hands of the 2 young girls and stood on the street. The shouts, peddlers, conversations, and quarrels entered his ears. Together with the images in his eyes, they weaved together to form the embryonic form of a prosperous era. It was a pity that the person who weaved it personally would not be able to see the birth of this prosperous era. It's a pity that His Majesty's health? Sigh, everyone is saying that His Majesty is probably, oh my God, why can't he open his eyes and see? The old man and the shop assistant were still chatting. The proud Lolita bit the sugar figurine in her mouth and lowered her head. She said softly, "Sir, let's go home." Li Yi nodded. He held their hands and walked in the direction they had come from. At the stall, the old man and the shop assistant had finished chatting. He glanced around and saw an extra ingot of silver on the table. He was stunned. When they walked into the courtyard, the proud Lolita suddenly raised her head and looked at him. She said, "Sir, when I return to the palace later, give me a jar of good wine. Father said that your wine is the best. All right." Li Yi smiled and nodded. Suddenly, he felt a chill at the tip of his nose. He raised his head to look at the sky. Yongning's clear voice rang in his ears. "Brother, it's snowing." Dong! A deep bell rang from a certain direction. Once, twice, the sound came from the east. One after another, it resounded throughout the capital. At the entrance of a certain brothel in the capital. Who's ringing the bell in broad daylight? A burly man mumbled in confusion. He saw the middle-aged man beside him suddenly stop in his tracks and turn to walk outside. He asked doubtfully, "Fifth Lord, what's wrong? Aren't you going to watch the show?" The middle-aged man shook his head and sighed. "I'm afraid we won't be able to watch the show today. Let's go back." The noisy streets of the capital gradually quietened down as the bell rang. Someone asked, "How many times did the bell ring?" 45. 45. The bell rang 45 times. It was the sound of a great funeral. A man faced the east and slowly knelt down. Beside him, A second man faced the east and followed suit. 3 people, 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, all the officials in the capital, regardless of rank or status, walked out of the guard room and walked to the courtyard. They faced the east and knelt down. At the palace gate, the imperial guards put down their weapons and slowly knelt down. At this moment, only the echoing bell rang in the entire capital. In the Li family, the imperial guard kneeling on the ground stood up and walked to Shanning and Yongning. He said in a hoarse voice, "Your Highness, it's time to return to the palace. 5th year of Jinghe, 15th of the first month, the Lantern Festival. 5th year of Jinghe, 15th of the first month. When the first snowflake of this winter landed on Li Yi's nose, it snowed continuously in 13 provinces of the Jing Kingdom. 5th year of Jinghe, 15th of the first month, the emperor collapsed." Chapter 972. There was no snow in the winter of the 4th year of Jinghe. At the beginning of the 5th year of Jinghe, it was the Lantern Festival, and the snowflakes in the capital were as heavy as a mat. Li Yi stood in the courtyard, and the bells seemed to be echoing in his ears. The snowflakes fell one after another, and in just a quarter of an hour, there was a snowman in the courtyard. Rui held an umbrella and stood quietly by his side. Drunken Mo and Ruoqing came over and looked at him with worry. Son-in-law, tears fell from Xiaohuan's eyes, and she helped Li Yi sweep the snowflakes off his shoulders and head. Mississippi Lu strode over, carried him on her shoulder, and walked briskly back to the room. She reached out to seal his acupoints, roughly took off his coat, and threw him on the bed, covering him with a thick quilt. She turned and closed the door in one go. The emperor had fallen, and the country was in mourning. The officials and nobles in the capital, regardless of their official position, were required to fast for 3 days. Within 27 days, the soldiers and civilians in the capital were required to take off their ornaments and wear plain clothes. Marriage was not allowed within a month. Slaughter was not allowed within 49 days, and pleasure was not allowed within 100 days. From the day of mourning in the capital, all temples and monasteries rang 30,000 times. In the 5th year of Jinghe, there was only the 15th of the first month and no Lantern Festival. The whole country mourned. The next time Li Yi saw Li Xian alone, it was already 7 days later. His clothes were still gorgeous, but his appearance was very haggard. His lips were chapped, and his beard was unshaven. Of course, Li Yi himself was not much better than him. In these 7 days, except for the ceremony that he needed to attend, he spent most of his time in bed. After sleeping for a long time, he had a headache, and it had not subsided until now. Emingzu was much better than the two of them, but her eyes were dull, and she looked a little haggard. The late emperor had passed away, and Li Xian was in charge of the funeral. She still needed to stabilize the affairs of the court. 2 days ago, concubine Chui hanged herself in Yeding. Li Xian sat cross-legged on the ground, and his voice was hoarse. Before she died, she shouted that she did not do anything wrong to your majesty, and that she would go down to accompany you. He looked at Li Yi and asked, "Do you feel that the palace is much more deserted than before?" "This palace has always been deserted." Li Yi shook his head and murmured. Li Xian sighed. "I really don't like this place." Li Yi looked at him and asked, "When will you be enthroned?" The country could not go a day without a ruler. The Jing Kingdom was surrounded by enemies. The news of His Majesty's death would soon spread throughout the world. At that time, it was unknown what Qi and Zhao would do. Within a month, a new ruler had to ascend the throne to stabilize the situation. "Let's wait for another month." Li Xian waved his hand. "I want to spend more time with my father. I haven't spent much time with him before." He turned to look at Emingzu and said, "I'll have to trouble Emingzu with the affairs of the court." As Li Yi walked out of the hall, a figure was about to enter. "Teacher." Li Han looked up at him and said in a low voice. Li Yi didn't know if it was an illusion, but he felt that Li Han was thinner than the last time he saw him. Li Yi patted him on the shoulder and raised his head to look around. Under the gray sky, The entire palace was filled with eunuchs and palace maids dressed in silk mourning dresses and hurrying about with their heads lowered. It was indeed much more deserted than before. He didn't leave the palace directly, but walked in another direction. This was the imperial harem, and without the emperor's decree, foreign officials were not allowed to enter. But there was an exception. In front of a palace maid bowed respectfully and said, "Marquis Li, please wait a moment. I'll go inform her ladyship." Li nodded and stood in front of the palace gate. Not long after, the palace maid came out and said, "Marquis Li, please come in." Li walked into this slightly smaller palace and bowed slightly to a woman in palace robes sitting on a couch. "Greetings, her ladyship Yen." "Lord Li, no need to be so polite." There was a trace of tiredness between concubine Yan's brows. She held her forehead and pointed in a direction, saying, "They're both in their rooms. It's good for you to go see." Li passed through a side door, and palace maids and eunuchs kept bowing to him. In front of a room, a palace maid said in a low voice, "Their highnesses haven't been sleeping well these past few days. They've just fallen asleep." "It's fine." Li gently pushed open the door and slowly closed it. On a large bed in the room, two figures, one big and one small, were hugging each other. Even in their dreams, their brows were tightly furrowed. Li walked to the side of the bed. His footsteps were very light and silent. The proud Lolita suddenly woke up from her dream. After seeing him, she was startled, and her eyes immediately filled with tears. She was wearing Hello Kitty pajamas and threw herself into Li's arms. Tears flowed out of her eyes as she choked. "Sir, Father Emperor is gone. I'm so scared." Her voice woke Yongning up. Yongning, who was wearing sheep pajamas, crawled out of the bed. Her eyes were slightly panicked, and she grabbed Shawning with one hand and Li with the other, not letting go. Li sat on the side of the bed and held them in his arms. He whispered, "With Sir here, don't be afraid." He looked at the dark room and the tear-stained face in his arms. He helped her wipe away her tears and said, "Hurry up and put on your clothes. Sir will take you out of the palace." "Really?" The proud Lolita raised her head to look at him, and there were still traces of tears on her face. "Really?" Li nodded. The proud Lolita left Li's arms, lowered her head, and whispered, Then, sir, please turn around. I'm going to change." Not long after, Li walked out holding the hands of the two girls. Concubine Yin stood up and slowly said, "Take them out of the palace. This is not a place for them to stay." Li nodded, looked at her, and said, "Thank you, Concubine Yin." Concubine Yin waved her hand and walked into the depths of the palace. Taking Shawning and Yongning out of the palace only required Concubine Yin's permission and a word from Li Xian. Concubine Yin did not have any objections. Li asked the eunuch to bring a message to Li Xian, and then he took them out of the palace. When he walked out of the palace, he looked back. Thick, dark clouds gathered above the palaces, and the pressure made it hard for people to breathe. Concubine Yin was right. This deep palace was indeed not a place for them to stay. Birth, old age, sickness, and death. This was a law that no one could escape. Heaven was unfair. Some people were born to be beggars, and some were born to be emperors. Heaven was also fair. No matter beggars or emperors, they could not escape death in the end. Heaven was impartial. The former emperor was loved and remembered by the people for his benevolent policies. During his reign, he carried out several reforms, improved the people's livelihood, supported the poor, adjusted the tax laws, and reorganized military discipline. He personally created a golden age that had never been seen since the founding of the Jing Kingdom. Now that the former emperor had passed away, the golden age had ended, and the whole country was grieving. In a month, the new emperor would be enthroned, and that would be the beginning of a golden age. A new golden age. Foreign Affairs, Chapter of Emperor Jing. On the 15th day of the first lunar month in the 5th year of Jinghe, it snowed continuously in 13 states of the capital region, and the emperor passed away in the Hall of Healing. At the entrance of the emergency room of Shijing City Central Hospital, China, A little girl of about 5 or 6 years old had tears in her eyes. She held a woman's hand and sobbed, "Mom, I'm sorry. If it weren't for me, Dad wouldn't have died." The woman squatted down and gently wiped the tears from her eyes. She said, "Xiao-Yi, don't cry. It's not your fault." The door of the emergency room suddenly opened, and a few doctors in white coats came out. The beautiful woman immediately stood up and asked with a worried face, "Doctor, how is he?" "He's out of danger for the time being," the doctor walking in front said, then shook his head and said, "The patient's head was hit, and he's still in a coma. If he can wake up within 24 hours, he'll be fine." "If he doesn't wake up," the woman asked in a trembling voice, "what if he doesn't wake up?" "Please be mentally prepared," the doctor said. The doctor said, and the woman fell back to her seat. "Dad, wake up quickly. Shout, he doesn't want to eat cotton candy. Shout, he wants Dad to wake up." In the ward, a pale man was lying on the bed. The little girl held his hand and whispered. The woman pushed the door open and came in. She squatted down and picked her up. She said, "Xiao-Yi, get ready to go to school." "Xiao, he doesn't want to go to school. Xiao, he wants Dad to wake up." The little girl shook her head and said stubbornly, "Dad has been sleeping for a month. Why hasn't he woken up yet? Adults can't stay in bed." The woman turned her face away so that the child wouldn't see her tears fall. She took a deep breath and said, "Xiao-Yi, Dad will sleep for a long time." "Mom, you're lying." The little girl raised her head and looked at her stubbornly. She said, "I saw Dad's fingers move just now. He's going to wake up soon." "Xiao-Yi." The woman's face sank for the first time. Seeing the tears in the little girl's eyes, she could only sigh and pick her up. She said softly, "Xiao-Yi, let's go to school, okay?" The little girl choked and said, "Mom, Xiao-Yi didn't lie. Dad's fingers really moved." The woman closed her eyes and looked at the man on the sickbed for a long time. Then she turned around and walked out of the ward with the child in her arms. "Where's this place? Who are you?" As she stepped out of the ward, a weak voice suddenly came from behind her. She turned her head in disbelief and looked at the man sitting on the sickbed. The man on the sickbed looked at her with the same disbelief and unconcealable surprise. He blurted out, "Liang Fei, Dad." The little girl broke free from her mother's arms and ran to the sickbed, throwing herself into the man's arms. "Xiao-Yi, be careful." The woman's face changed, and she hurried over. "Yongning." The man looked at the little girl in his arms and murmured. His face suddenly showed a painful expression. He grabbed his head and growled in his throat. The woman's face changed greatly, and she asked, "What's wrong with you? Where are you feeling uncomfortable?" Doctor. After a while, the man put his hand down from his head. He looked at the woman and shook his head. He said, I'm fine." "How can you be fine?" The woman's face became more anxious. She said, "Check again." "I'm really fine." The man got off the sickbed and held the little girl in his arms. He took a deep breath and said with a smile, "I haven't felt this good in a long time. So that brat didn't lie to me." He murmured in a low voice and looked at a small box in the ward. There was a figure moving inside. "Is this television? Are you really fine?" The woman looked at him suspiciously. The man looked at her and said with a smile, "I'm really fine." "If you're fine." The woman narrowed her eyes and looked at him. She asked, "Li Hong, tell me, which little vixen is Liang Fei?" Unbelievable. This kind of thing can actually happen. Miracle. It's really a miracle. In the hospital, a group of old men held examination reports in their hands and surrounded a middle-aged man, clicking their tongues in wonder. Facing the director of the central hospital and more than 10 leading doctors in the medical world, the man's expression was calm. He asked with a smile, "Can we go now?" An old man looked at him from head to toe for a while before nodding. "You can go after signing this piece of paper. However, to be on the safe side, come back for a follow-up in a week." The man took the ballpoint pen from him. After looking at it in his hand, he frowned. He glanced around and caught a glimpse of something in the corner of the office. He strode over. When everyone saw this, they all looked over. He picked up a writing brush, dipped it in ink, and wrote down his name. Good writing. At that moment, an old man's eyes suddenly lit up. He looked at him and asked, May I know which leading master in the calligraphy world is this gentleman's teacher? Li. After smiling, the man picked up the little girl with one hand and the woman with the other and strode away. Li. The old man stroked his beard and said doubtfully, I've never heard of him. Walking out of the hospital, the man looked at the towering buildings and the iron shells shuttling on the streets. His face showed shock. When did you learn to write with a brush? The woman turned her head and looked at him in surprise. She asked, why didn't I know? The man smiled and said, a long time ago. When the woman was about to speak, the mobile phone in her pocket suddenly rang. The man looked at the mobile phone in her hand in a daze and murmured, voice from 1,000 miles away. The woman smiled and answered the phone. She said, Mom, yes, he's already awake. We've checked him and there's no problem. We'll be back soon. After hanging up the phone, she found that the man had been looking at her. She blushed slightly and said angrily, why are you looking at me? The man smiled and said, because you're good looking. Don't be serious. The woman glared at him and said, are you hungry? Let's go eat first. The man shook his head and said, I want to go to the library first. The woman looked at him and asked uncertainly, now? The man nodded and said, now. Well, the provincial library is only 2 stops away from here. The woman nodded and said, you've just been discharged from the hospital. It's appropriate for you to exercise. Let's walk. As soon as she finished speaking, a panicked voice suddenly came from the hospital. Catch the thief. Catch the thief. A figure ran out of the hospital in a panic. When he passed by the man, he suddenly stopped. It was not because he felt guilty and wanted to repent, but because a hand like an iron clamp grabbed his wrist. You're courting death. He was shocked and angry. He pulled out a dagger from his waist and stabbed the man's waist. No! The woman only had time to let out a scream. The dagger in the thief's hand fell into the man's hand. The man held the little girl in one hand and threw the dagger aside. He looked at the thief and said coldly, how dare you? The thief looked at him and felt an oppressive momentum. Suddenly, a burst of fear came from the bottom of his heart. His back was soaked with cold sweat. His legs gave way and he fell to the ground. Wow, Dad is so powerful. The little girl put her arms around the man's neck. Her eyes were full of little stars. She kissed him hard on the face. The woman next to him also looked at him in disbelief. Her beautiful eyes were full of splendor. The hospital security guards rushed out and restrained the thief. A young woman ran out and bowed to the man. My ID card and bank card are in the bag. Thank you so much. The man looked at her miniskirt and revealed a small part of her chest. He frowned and said, you're naked in broad daylight. What a scandal. The young woman looked up at him and said, the man shook his head. As a woman, how can you be so shameless? You're crazy. The young woman glared at him and hurried away in high heels. A moment later, in the sightseeing elevator of the provincial library, the man looked at the gradually shrinking figure below and smiled. Why did you have to come to the library? Walking out of the elevator, the woman shook her head and said, what books do you want to buy? I'll go buy them. You and Xiaoyi sit here for a while. The man shook his head and said, just walk around here. I'll go back in a while. Next to a bookshelf, the man picked up a book and murmured Apollo program, Amsterdam, moon landing, universe, black hole, interstellar travel, TNT, atomic bomb, hydrogen bomb. He walked to another place and picked up a newspaper. iPhone 10 production stopped. Song Jinkong announced marriage. The woman walked to his side and asked in confusion, what are you talking about? Nothing. The man smiled and closed his eyes. He quickly opened them and said, let's go home. You're not buying books? Not anymore. The man nodded. He carried the little girl and held the woman's hand. When they walked to the elevator, he glanced at the rest area and suddenly stopped in his tracks. The woman turned around and looked at him. What's wrong? I met a friend. The man put the little girl down and said, Xiao, and Mom stay here for a while. Dad'll be there soon. He walked to the rest area and walked to the side of a young man. He pointed at the computer on the table and asked with a smile, young man, can I borrow your computer for a while? The young man raised his head and nodded sleepily. He made way for the man. The man sat down and opened the browser. He typed the words Jing Kingdom in the search box and clicked on search. The Way of Confucianism, the Unfettered Scholar. The man clicked on a few web pages, shook his head, and closed them. Thank you. What's your name? He smiled and extended his hand. The young man was stunned. He shook his hand and said, Li Yi, nice to meet you. The man smiled at him. The young man nodded and turned around to sit down. The man raised his leg and kicked the young man's butt. The young man lay on the ground in a very indecent position. How dare you flirt with my daughter? I'll collect some interest first. The man glared at him fiercely and turned around to leave. The young man got up from the ground in shock. He stared blankly at the elegant man in a suit as he left. He cursed in his heart. He just came to the library to take a nap, but he actually met a lunatic at the door of the elevator. The middle-aged man picked up the little girl and held the woman's hand. He smiled and said, Let's go home. The little girl looked at him and asked worriedly, Dad won't sleep again, right? The man touched her head and said with a smile, He won't. The woman beside him glanced at him and said, I'll let you go for now. Tell me honestly who Liang Fei is when we go back. Chapter 973. It was already the 3rd month of the 5th year of Jing He. In the 3rd month of spring, the grass was long and the orioles were flying. It was the season of recovery. The green willows in the hibiscus garden had already sprouted new buds, and the apricot forest was filled with a delicate fragrance. The blue water rippled in the breeze, and a girl's voice was crisp and sweet. Sir, come and see, I caught a big fish. Li walked over and helped Shanning take the fish off the hook. At the age of 14, the girl's face had lost most of its immaturity. When she raised her head and smiled, it seemed that the spring scenery in the garden was a lot brighter. A guard took the fat fish, skillfully cut open its belly, removed the scales, and handed it to Prince Jean, Li Han, who was next to the grill. Li Han, who was close to 13 years old and could roast fish well, was already the official dean of the academy. His originally chubby face had started to become more angular. At this time, it had been more than half a month since Li Xian ascended the throne at the beginning of March. The former emperor, Renzong, died at the beginning of the year. Jing He's reign ended in the 5th year, but to establish a new era, it would have to wait until next year. Just like the late spring, in the 3rd month of spring, the capital and even the entire Jing kingdom began to exude vitality. The court was running steadily. The people lived and worked in peace and contentment. The public security was good, and the economy was booming. Of course, these had nothing to do with the unreliable emperor. Li Xian was using a microscope to observe the microorganisms in the lake. Things made with glass were no longer much of a challenge for the Academy of Sciences. They had already made presbyopic glasses, which could be said to be a blessing for some old ministers in the court. It was said that after an old imperial censor's presbyopia was cured, he didn't say a word about Li Xian wanting to increase research funds for the Academy of Sciences. Li Xian, the bastard emperor, was so lazy that when he presided over the funeral of the late emperor, he entrusted all the affairs of the court to his assistant, Minggu. After he ascended to the throne, he seemed to have completely forgotten about this matter. At first, he did not forget to attend the court every day, but he only persisted for 10 days before handing over all the affairs of the court to Mingzu with the excuse that he was busy with his research. The officials had nothing to say. After going through so many things, they understood that the Jing kingdom could not live without a princess, nor could it live without His Majesty. Such an arrangement seemed absurd, but it was the most suitable one. Li Yi held Yongning's hand and walked towards the lawn with Shanning by his side. 2 small figures walked and crawled on the lawn. Occasionally, they would lose their balance and fall. Rui and Crown Princess. Now, they should be called the Empress. Rui and the Empress had told the maids and guards around them to let them play by themselves. After falling and beating, the bodies of the children, who were almost 1.5 years old, would become stronger. From the 4th year to the 5th year of Jing He, among the officials and nobles in the capital, the Wang family was undoubtedly the biggest winner. In the beginning, many people thought that the Wang family was destroying the foundation of the family by marrying the crown prince instead of the king of Shu, who was favored by the officials. Now, those people had to rely on the Wang family to survive. They had the most powerful financial resources in the Jing Kingdom and were backed by the most powerful forces in the Jing Kingdom. Who could compete with the Wang family? If there was only one family. In terms of financial resources, ordinary people would naturally think of the god of wealth's family in the Jing Kingdom. However, a small number of people knew that the Li family's financial resources were not far from the Wang family's, or even surpassed it. In terms of power, although the Wang family had the empress, they still couldn't compare with the favored officials of the two dynasties. The Wang family didn't need to compare either, because the Wang family and the Li family had a special relationship. Yongning and Shaoning ran to play with Li Duan and Li Rui. Li walked to Rui and Wang Qin and bowed slightly. "Greetings, Your Highness." Wang Qin smiled and said, "Sister Rui and I are like sisters." "County Marquis Li, you don't have to be so polite." Although Li Xian was the emperor, there was only one empress in the harem. Many officials in the court had repeatedly written to him, asking him to appoint concubines, but to no avail. This was also the reason why the Wang family's position in the court was becoming more and more stable. If the emperor didn't appoint a new concubine, there was no suspense about who would be the next emperor. Li Han came over with a plate and said, "Sir, the fish is grilled. I didn't put too much seasoning on it." Li Han's grilling technique had been unanimously approved by everyone. So Prince Jean was also a part-time grill hand in addition to being the dean of the academy. Rui liked to eat lightly flavored food, so Li asked him to put less seasoning. The empress' taste should be similar. She didn't have many friends in the palace, so she often called Rui to the palace. Li Xian later directly moved his family to Furong Garden. Anyway, there were only 2 people in his family. This place wasn't far from the Li family, so he and Rui often visited each other. Ladies first. There were many fish bones in the lake. Li used chopsticks to pick out the bones, then handed the plate to Rui and walked towards Li Xian by the lake. Wang Qin sighed softly and said, "When father was alive, his favorite people were my husband, Mingzu, and County Marquis Li. Father's death was a great blow to them." Rui smiled and said, "My husband often said that death is not the end. Maybe the former emperor just went to another world." The former emperor was the emperor, a dragon among men. Even in another world, he could live very well. I believe that His Majesty and Her Royal Highness also thinks so. You have an undeserved reputation as the Dean of the Academy of Mathematics. All the matters of the Academy are done by Xiao Han. It's just a title, and there's no need to trouble you. Why do you want to resign?" Li Xian withdrew his gaze from the microscope and looked at him. Opportunities should always be left to young people. Li waved his hand and said, "Xiao Han has been coveting that position for a long time. As a teacher, I naturally have to fulfill his wish." Li Xian did not continue this topic. He thought of something and suddenly said, "I almost forgot that you are only a county marquis now. How about I make you a county magistrate?" "Forget it. How about a duke?" Since the founding of the country, no duke had been conferred, not even a county magistrate. His title of county marquis had been an exception for decades. Li looked at Li Xian and asked, "Why don't you make me a prince?" "You want to be a prince?" Li Xian thought for a while and said, "If you want to be a prince, I'll write an edict when I go back." If Li Xian really issued this edict, there might be a courtier who would kill himself tomorrow. For the sake of his own reputation, Li waved his hand and said, "Forget it. A county marquis is good. His Majesty is gone, and there's no point in being a duke or a prince." He looked at Li Xian and said, "You can't throw all the matters of court politics to Mingzhu. You are the emperor, and you are also a man. Can't you act like a man and shoulder the responsibilities you should bear?" Li Xian looked at him and asked, "What's wrong? Do you feel sorry for her?" "If you feel sorry for her, you can help her yourself." Li Xian glanced at him and said, "You and Mingzu can solve any problem if you work together." Li took a deep breath and asked, "Are you the emperor, or am I the emperor?" Li Xian asked back, "Do you like Mingzu, or do I like Mingzu?" Li Yi was defeated again. However, you were right about one thing. Li Xian thought for a while and suddenly said, "Since you are a man, you should bear the responsibility that a man should have." Li Yi nodded. This guy was somewhat responsible. Li Xian looked in a certain direction and murmured, "Little Han is already 13 years old. In another 2 years, he will be a man, right?" Somewhere by the lake, Li Han, who was roasting fish, suddenly had goosebumps and his body couldn't help but tremble. Chapter 974. In a feudal society where imperial power was supreme, the throne was the most dignified and supreme thing. Li Xian's way of thinking, which was like kicking the throne around like a ball, was very different from the ancient people. Li Yi felt deeply guilty, thinking about how Li Yi was obsessed with mental arithmetic and was exactly the same as him. As his teacher, Li Yi felt that his sins were even deeper. Li Xian was still young, and his thoughts were too idealistic and unrealistic. In 2 years, he would understand that the throne wasn't something he could give up just because he wanted to, and he could give it to whoever he wanted. Li Han could be a good head of the Arithmetic Academy, and he could be a cook, but it was unlikely that he could be a good emperor. At least, this was what Li Yi thought when he ate the fish he roasted. After handing over the fish with the bones removed to Yong Ning and Shaning, Li Han walked over and looked at Li Xian in the distance. He asked hesitantly, "Teacher, what were you talking about with my brother?" Li Yi picked up a piece of fish and asked, "What's wrong?" Li Han shook his head and said, "Nothing. It's just that I have a bad feeling." Children nowadays had a strong desire to live. Li Yi looked at him and shook his head, saying, "We didn't talk about much. Don't think too much. Go roast another fish." Furon Garden had a quiet environment and pleasant scenery. Other than Xujiang Gardens, it was one of the 2 most beautiful imperial gardens in the capital. The Li family wasn't far from these 2 places. When he and Rui went home, they didn't even need to take a carriage. Li Yi carried the already asleep Li Duan. Rui tilted her head and looked at him, asking, "Husband, do you feel that Dwayner really likes Xiao Rui?" Such a young child actually didn't know whether he liked or not. It was just that the 2 children had played together for a long time and were used to it. If it was a kitten or a puppy, he would still like it. Li looked at her and asked, "Did Her Majesty and Yangzi say something?" Rui smiled and nodded. She said that Dwayner and Xiao Rui were born on the same day. It's fate from their previous lives. If they can grow up together like this, they could be considered childhood sweethearts. Why don't we settle the marriage now? Because of his own experience, Li Yi abhorred things like arranged marriages or child betrothal. He shook his head and said, "Their affairs will depend on themselves in the future. We'd better not interfere too much." Rui obviously liked Xiao Rui very much. She thought for a moment and said, "But Xiao Rui is a princess. When the time comes, many people will want to marry into the royal family. If the Dwayner likes her and she is betrothed to someone else, then let's snatch." Li Yi said without hesitation, "My wife is the best at snatching people." Rui took Li Duan from his arms and said lightly, "I have something to discuss with Sister Vimo, husband. Sleep in the study tonight." Li Yi shook his head and said, "Don't. If there's anything to discuss, let's go together." Rui looked at him and asked, "Sisters AMO and I are going to discuss all night. Does husband want to join us?" "If you don't mind." Li Yi looked at the smile on Rui's face, waved his hand, and said, "Forget it. That bed is too small for 3 people." He had originally planned to marry Zhe Mo at the beginning of the year, but because of the death of the former emperor, he could only postpone the date. Now, although a month had passed, there was no auspicious date in a short period of time. Of course, the more important reason was that he thought that the time between the 2 events was too short, and he felt uneasy. He was gratified that Zhe Mo could understand this and even comforted him. How lucky he was in this life to be able to meet these women. Thinking about it, this might also be God's compensation for his previous life. After all, he went to the library with the intention of learning. Not only did he meet a psychopath who returned kindness with ingratitude, but he also encountered an incredible fire. God owed him too much. At the gate of the Li mansion, Li Yi unexpectedly saw a person. The gatekeeper of the Li family said politely to a young man, "Sir, my master and madam have gone out. I don't know when they will be back. Why don't you come again tomorrow, or wait in the mansion?" The young man cupped his hands and said, "In that case, I will come again another day. No need for another day." Li Yi walked over, patted Jiang Zian on the shoulder, and said with a smile, "Brother Jiang, what's the matter? Let's talk inside." The expression on Jiang Zian's face immediately became respectful. "Lord Li." In the mansion, the maids served good tea. Li looked at Jiang Zian and asked with a smile, "Brother Zian should be leaving soon, right?" "Yes, the appointment from the Ministry of Personnel has been issued. I will leave tomorrow." Jiang Zian nodded and suddenly stood up. He bowed deeply to Li Yi and said, "Jiang Zian, thanks Lord Li for saving my life." His former friend had almost pushed him into the abyss. His former enemy had not only saved him from prison, but had also given him a bright career. At this moment, standing in front of Li Yi, his heart was in turmoil, and he could not control himself. Li Yi stood up and helped him up. He said, "Brother Jiang, please be careful on this trip to Qing and Prefecture. Anqi County is also your hometown. You must govern it well in the future. Don't let your people down." Jiang Zian's expression was solemn. He bowed and said, "Zian will not let Lord Li down." Li Yi smiled and said, "You don't have to be so polite. Sit." After Jiang Zian sat down, he cupped his hand again and said, "I have offended you in the past. Lord Li, please forgive me." "I don't mention the past." Li Yi waved his hand and said, "How can there be no wine when old friends gather? Servants, bring wine." The Li family's cooks were very fast. In a quarter of an hour, a jar of wine and a few dishes were served. Li Yi had once made up his mind to never drink again, but he did not persist for long. During this time, he had failed to compete with Mississippi Liu and Mingzhu in terms of drinking, but his tolerance for alcohol had greatly improved. Jiang Zian was very restrained at first, but after a few cups of wine, he gradually became intoxicated. "Lord Li, Brother Li, do you really think of me as a friend?" "Of course. I, Li Yi, don't have many friends. You, Jiang Zian, are one of them. Don't forget, we are friends who have been through life and death together. Since we are friends, there are some things that I have to say." Jiang Zian's eyes were hazy from the alcohol. He looked at him discontentedly and said, "Miss Ruoqing is such a good woman. Even if she is the Empress, don't you want to find her? You scolded those Jin Shi in Prince Ning Mansion. Where is your courage?" Li Yi slapped him on the head and scolded, "At this time, you still dare to think about my Ruoqing? I don't think about her." Jiang Zian's face turned red. He stared at him and said, "I just feel that what you did was not like a man. I am not like a man." Li Yi looked at Jiang Zian and took the woman who was pouring wine for him into his arms. He said, "Ruoqing, tell him, do I look like a man?" Jiang Zian was shocked. "Ah, you are Miss Ruoqing?" At the door, hearing the man's hearty laughter coming from the room, drunken Mo lowered her head, and a trace of sadness appeared in her eyes. Although he was laughing, it did not mean that he was really happy. If he was really happy, he would not have to drink. If he was not happy, it would be difficult for her to smile. Rui walked to her side, glanced into the room, and whispered, "After the former emperor left, my husband did not have many enemies, nor did he have many friends. He once said that after the former emperor left, no one could shelter them from the wind and rain." Drunken Mo looked at the figure in the room and shook her head. Now, in the capital, who can set off a storm? They respect him, fear him, and fear him. He actually does not like this. Rui took her hand and shook her head. "There is only one side of my husband that we do not understand." Jiang Zian was soon drunk and was helped to the guest room by the servants of the Li family to rest. Li Yi leaned against the chair and rested for a moment. When he opened his eyes, he saw an old face full of wrinkles. Since the death of the emperor, he had not seen this old face for a long time. Chapter 975. After the death of the previous emperor, Changde had gone to the mausoleum to guard it. There was still a long way to go before the one-year deadline. Seeing him here, other than pleasant surprise, Li was also surprised. "Chang, why have you come out?" he asked in surprise. He then waved his hand and poured a cup of wine for him. "Don't say anything else. It's not easy to see each other. Let's drink." Changde's old face remained expressionless. He didn't touch the wine cup. Lightly, he said, "The Emperor can't see the world anymore, so I came out to see for the Emperor. I say, can you not always put on that dead face?" Li handed the wine cup to his hand and said with some dissatisfaction, "If you have nothing to do, smile more. Smiling can extend your life by 5 seconds. You're already so old. Shouldn't you be more careful?" Changde opened his mouth and asked, "Should I smile like this?" Li looked at his smile and paused. He then shook his head and said, "Never mind. It's best if you don't smile." Changde picked up the wine jar and took a big gulp before saying, "It's all thanks to you that the Emperor was able to last these years. If it weren't for you, the Emperor would not have been able to let go of the world before he died." Li waved his hand. "There's no need to say such things." Changde put down the wine jar and looked at him. "What plans do you have for the future?" "What plans?" Li thought for a bit and then shook his head. "I don't know. What about you? In a year, will you still return to the court?" Very few people knew that Changde was not only the head of the internal surveillance, but also the true leader of the Secret Intelligence Bureau. He had single-handedly established the Secret Intelligence Bureau. He was a knife in the hands of the previous 2 emperors, a sharp blade hanging over the heads of the officials and nobles in Jingdo. "Didn't you say that opportunities are for the young?" Changde looked at him and shook his head. "Even you're not a young man. So why should this old man occupy this position and not leave? The previous emperor entrusted his majesty to me, and now that his majesty has left, this old man's mission is complete." He lowered his head and drank without saying a word. The departure of the former emperor not only represented the replacement of the old and the new dynasties, but it was also a turning point for him, for Changde, for Li Xian, for Mingzu, and for some others. Once one's position changed, one's former friends and enemies would no longer be the same. Changde raised his head and took another gulp. Suddenly, he said, "Before His Majesty left, he asked me to pass a few words to you." "What did His Majesty say?" Li looked up at him. Changde narrowed his eyes and said, "His Majesty wants me to tell you that if you betray Mingzu, he won't let you off even if he's in the underworld or in another world." Li's expression didn't change as he asked, "What else? When you leave, take Yongning with you. She can't live without you." Li nodded. These were 2 souls that were connected to each other. Not only could Yongning not live without him, he could not live without Yongning either. He looked at Changde and continued to ask, "Anything else? Don't hurt Xiaoning. She's still a child who doesn't understand anything." Changde put down his wine cup and said, "When she truly understands these things, let her make her own decision." Li looked at him and asked, "Understand what?" Changde shook his head and said, "I'm just passing on His Majesty's words to you." Li thought about it and nodded. "Okay." After the death of the former emperor, Chief Eunuch Changde guarded the imperial mausoleum for a year. During this year, he didn't leave the mausoleum at all. As someone who had followed the former emperor his entire life, no one understood the former emperor better than him, and no one knew what he wanted to do better than him. When he saw Changde out of the Li residence, he ran into the slovenly old man. After getting to know the slovenly old man, Li understood that reaching the peak in any field was not by chance, but by necessity. Before getting to know the slovenly old man, the most diligent person he had seen was Yang Liuqing, followed by Mississippi Liu. After getting to know the slovenly old man, Li finally understood how he had reached the Grandmaster realm. He was already so old, but he was still working so hard. If he didn't become a Grandmaster, there would be no justice in this world. However, being a master was lonely. As a Grandmaster, only Grandmasters could be his opponent. Rui was a Grandmaster, but she wouldn't spar with the slovenly old man. Taoist Nun was also a Grandmaster, but she was thousands of miles away. There were also Grandmasters nearby. Li still didn't know what realm second great uncle was at, but he was definitely strong enough to be a match for the slovenly old man. Unfortunately, he wasn't so lonely in front of second great uncle. Of course, the closest grandmaster was Old Man Chong in front of him. The two were about the same age, and their realms were similar. They were indeed excellent opponents. The slovenly old man walked past them, paused, and quickly walked back, looking at Changde. At this moment, Li Yi actually saw some kind of inexplicable light in his eyes. "Fight?" The slovenly old man looked at Changde and suddenly said. Old Man Chong maintained his usual aloof manner, glanced at him indifferently, and walked out of the door. The slovenly old man smiled disdainfully. "You don't dare?" This kind of clumsy provocation naturally had no effect on Old Man Chong, who was familiar with all kinds of tricks in the palace. Changde's footsteps were very steady, and he was about to step out of the door. The slovenly old man said angrily, "You sly old man, has the courage of a grandmaster been eaten by a dog?" Changde paused, but the next moment he still walked out of the door without hesitation. The slovenly old man thought for a moment and said calmly, "You don't have a dick." Li suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. Then he heard a familiar cold voice. "Since you want to die, I'll fulfill your wish." He ran inside, shouting as he ran, "Rui, Rui, come out and watch the show." Mississippi Lu was in the room, writing at the desk. She was probably dealing with Lu Meng's matter. The current her was becoming more and more like a qualified chief of Wulin. "What's the matter?" She looked up at Li Yi, who had suddenly barged in, and asked. "There's no time to explain. Let's go out first." Li Yi grabbed her arm and ran outside. A battle between grandmasters was not something that could be seen every day, especially when grandmasters fought with their lives on the line. Mississippi Lu was only one step away from this realm. After watching it, she might have some feelings. There was no need for Li Yi to explain it all. Mississippi Lu was pulled out of the door by him. When she saw the two vague figures outside, she had already stopped and could not look away. Li Yi only saw two shadows and could not help but ask curiously, "How is it? Who has the upper hand now?" "Don't talk." Mississippi Lu reached out to cover his mouth. Li Yi moved her hand away and smelled a familiar fragrance. He spat a few times and then looked at the field again. Old Man Chong might really be fighting with his life this time. He fought from the ground to the top of the wall, from the top of the wall to the sky, and finally from the sky to the ground. Li Yi could not see their moves clearly. After about a quarter of an hour, there was a loud bang. The two figures separated and stood on one side of the wall. It felt like the battle between Shimin Shueishue and Yi Guqing. "Awesome. I haven't fought so happily for a long time." The sloppy old man laughed and said, "I can't beat you, and you can't beat me. Let's call it a draw today. Let's fight another day. What do you think?" Changde's fists, which were hidden in his sleeves, trembled slightly. He looked at him coldly and jumped off the wall. Without saying anything, he turned around and left. Seeing him leave, an unnatural flush appeared on the sloppy old man's face. He jumped down from the top of the wall and muttered, "This old thing is worthy of being from the palace." If it wasn't for the fact that he has made some progress these days, he would have lost face today. Mississippi Lu stood where she was, deep in thought. Li looked at her, walked to the sloppy old man, and asked, "Sue, how difficult is it to break through the bottleneck of supreme power? Do you have any experience?" "It's difficult, but it's not difficult either." The sloppy old man looked back at Mississippi Lu and said, "Some people find it difficult in their bodies, while others find it difficult in their hearts. Let go of your obsession and worries, and only then can you pass the barrier of your heart." After saying that, he strode inside. Li followed closely and asked curiously, "What do you mean?" "Those who should understand will understand as soon as they hear it, and it's useless for those who shouldn't understand to say it." The sloppy old man smiled and said, "Whether or not your clan's second miss and that little princess can take that step in this lifetime will depend on whether or not they can overcome the barrier of their hearts. What stubbornness, worry, or lack thereof. Instead of advising others to practice diligently, what idealism was this? Li Yi looked at the sloppy old man and suddenly asked, "So, Elder Su has also once let go of his stubbornness and worries?" The sloppy old man stopped, and a complicated expression appeared on his face, but he did not answer. Li Yi thought for a moment and said, "I have one last question." "Yes." The sloppy old man's figure disappeared, leaving only a long sigh. Chapter 976. Who do you love? Li Yi looked at the empty courtyard and asked in confusion. He just wanted to ask the sloppy old man what his chances of becoming a grandmaster were. After all, if Rui and Immingzu were blocked at the door of grandmaster status and couldn't take that step, he still had a chance to catch up and restore his manhood. Who did he say he loved? Changda? He had heard of friendship forged by fighting, but he had never heard of gay love forged by fighting. Could it be that the two of them had fallen in love with each other and developed into a gay relationship? Ear! Hearing a voice coming from behind, Li looked back and saw the old woman standing at the door looking at him. "Come in with me for a moment." The old woman turned and walked into the room. Li didn't hesitate and followed. The old woman had always been very concerned about the Li family. This time, she had set the date and written all the invitations. All she had to do was wait to send them out, but it was a national funeral. She felt a bit regretful. After the 1-month deadline, she mentioned it to him twice in a vague way, but he deliberately avoided it. It seemed that he couldn't wait any longer. The old woman put away the wine jars in the room and said, "The previous emperor treated you and the Li family well when he was alive. You should be grieving when the previous emperor passed away. But the dead are gone, and the living must live on well. You still have Rui, Zumo, and Dwainer. You shouldn't be overly sad." Li smiled and nodded. "I know." In the beginning, his mood was indeed gloomy for a long time. That was because ever since they first met in Qing and Fu, there had been no relationship between the ruler and his official. They were ruler and official, and they were also friends. Even though he had always been mentally prepared, when the day really came, it was still difficult to accept. But just as the old woman said, the dead were gone, and the living must live well. Being overly immersed in the sorrow of the past was irresponsible for the future and the performance of a coward. His Majesty didn't come today? The old mistress nodded slightly and suddenly asked. As an emperor, Li Xian did not attend to his duties. Every day, he would visit the Li family. Occasionally, it would be Li Yi and Rui. Li Yi explained to the old mistress, "He didn't come today. Rui and I just came back from Lotus Garden." Madame Dowager looked at him and asked, "You and His Majesty have known each other for 4 years, right?" Li Yi thought about it and said, "Less than 4 years. He and Li Xian first met in July of the first year of Jinghe. Now, it was March of the 5th year of Jinghe. There were still 4 months until the 4th year. 4 years is not a short time." The old mistress sighed and said, "It is the Li family's fortune to be favored by 2 emperors. But you must remember that His Majesty is His Majesty. He is no longer the crown prince Li Xian of the past." It was said that being in the emperor's company was like living with a tiger. Since ancient times, there had been countless cases of good bows being hidden after the birds had been killed. It seemed that emperors were supposed to be cold and heartless. Most people, including the old mistress, thought so too. But none of the emperors that Li Yi knew were like this. The previous emperor was benevolent, not only toward the court but also toward people. After Li Xian became emperor, his temperament did not change at all. He was not a qualified emperor. He was straightforward and free. The things that the old mistress worried about would not happen, at least for the time being. But even though he believed in Li Xian, others did not. Since ancient times, heaven, earth, emperor, and teacher have to respect etiquette and ethics. The old mistress looked at him and sighed again. She said, "I know that you and His Majesty are close friends, but people's hearts change. For the sake of the Li family, you must be more careful and not fall too deeply into it." Li thought for a long time and then lowered his head. He said, "Grandson will remember. I still envy you. You only have the title of Golden Ziguang Doctor. Li Xian put his hands behind his head as he lay on the rocking chair. Looking at the sky, he murmured, "Beautiful wives and concubines, no worldly affairs, free and unfettered. What more can a husband ask for in life? You want to take concubines?" Li Yi sat by the stone table and looked at him. He said, "If you want to do it, then do it. Your harem is so empty. It should be enriched." Li Xian looked back. The two women should be in the room. Only then did he relax. He said, "We are not the same. I only need Qin," or Li Yi suddenly asked, "How is your brother Shun?" "Brother Shun?" Li Xian thought for a moment and said, "He has already graduated from the Mathematics Institute. I feel that he is more suitable for our Academy of Sciences. I don't know where the Ministry of Appointments will send him, so I am preparing to headhunt him." Then he felt that something was wrong. He looked at Li Yi and said, "Don't try to change the topic. I, the Emperor, am not as free as you, the Marquis. This is too unreasonable." Li Xian was clearly brooding over this matter. He hesitated for a moment and said, "Prime Minister Qin has already resigned 3 times, and I persuaded him to come back. The Qin family has suffered such a great change. Prime Minister Qin is disheartened, and his health is not as good as before. If he has made up his mind, I will allow him to retire. After Prime Minister Qin's resignation, the position of the right minister will be vacant. Only you can take this position. At that time, you and Mingzhu will be in cahoots." Li Yi pointed at Li Xian, looked behind him, and said, "He is cursing you." Mingzhu had just finished sparring with Rui. Her hair was wet. Li Xian jumped up from the chair and said, "I'm going to see Xiao." Mingzhu was a noble princess and always had a heroic spirit that did not lose to any man. This heroic spirit was something that even the Lu second young miss did not have. In other words, even Mississippi Lu was more feminine than Mingzhu. Of course, these words could not be said in front of him. Otherwise, he might be greeted with a beating from both women. However, when she took a bath and put up her wet hair in front of him, Li felt that his understanding of her was not complete. At this time, Her Royal Highness still had a little bit of femininity. After putting up her hair, she looked at Li Yi and said in surprise, "Why are you looking at me? Is there something on my face?" Li Yi shook his head repeatedly. No. She did not continue this topic and asked, "Did Chief Chong come to see you 2 days ago?" Li Yi was puzzled. He did not return to the palace. Mingzhu shook her head and said, "He only came here to take a look around the capital and then return to the mausoleum." Li Yi explained, "His Majesty had a few words for him to bring to me." "Father?" Although her and Li Xian's identity had been announced, she was still used to calling the former emperor this way. Li Yi nodded. Mingzhu looked at her, thought for a moment, and asked, "What did father say?" She shouldn't have asked this question, but she wanted to know anything about her father. Li Yi thought for a moment and said, "His Majesty asked me to take care of you and Li Xian." Mingzhu looked at him and said, "Father already said this the other night." Li Yi was speechless for a moment. He could not tell her that her father told him not to let her down in the future, and that when she did not want to be the empress, they could make do with each other. His Majesty also said that Shanning is only a child now. When she grows up, she can make her own decisions. Mingzhu looked at him and asked in confusion, "What does that mean?" "Yes, sir, what does that mean?" The girl ran out of the room, thought for a moment, and said with some dissatisfaction, "I am already 14 years old. I am not a child anymore." Li Yi patted her head and said, "When will you stop saying that you're not a child anymore?" "You're not a child anymore." The dizzy girl nodded and said, "When that time comes, will I be able to make my own decisions?" Li Yi nodded. "This is your father's verbal order. It is the same as an imperial edict. I knew father treats me the best." The girl smiled excitedly, and her eyes flashed. She murmured, "Can I make my own decisions? I will ask Brother Xian to write an imperial edict when I go back." Chapter 977. What are you thinking about? Li Yi flicked his finger on her forehead and said, "This imperial edict will only count when you grow up." Among the girls, Duanwu was the most obedient, Yongning was the most adorable, and Shanning was the most mischievous one. She had countless ideas, and no one knew what she was thinking in her little head. That's what I said. Shanning covered her forehead and ran away with a chuckle. Soon, she ran back and asked, "Then how old is considered to be grown up?" Lee rubbed her hair and said, "You will know when you grow up." After Shanning ran away, Li thought of what just happened and turned to Mingzu and said, "Li Xian doesn't think before doing things. You should suppress him." "You mean the position of the right minister?" And Mingzu thought about it and said, "But I think this position is quite suitable for you. Don't you want to be in cahoots with me?" "Cahoots?" Li shook his head and asked, "Who's the wolf and who's the bay?" And Mingzu thought about it and said, "I think it's the bay. I like to be in the top." Since the death of the former emperor at the beginning of the year, the court was generally peaceful. It wasn't until April that there was another disturbance. Prime Minister Qin resigned many times. After the emperor agreed, he was conferred the title of special minister. This was also a non-official who didn't directly participate in the court affairs. His position was even higher than the Minister of Honor. He had the right to attend the court meetings and greet the prime minister. The left and right ministers were the two towering pillars of the court. Now that one of them had fallen, it was natural to build another one. In recent years, the court of the Jing Kingdom was becoming younger. There weren't many senior officials like Prime Minister Qin and Prime Minister Shen left. Because of their old age, they weren't suitable for the position. A country could live without a ruler, but it couldn't live without a prime minister. In the court meeting at the beginning of April, the ownership of the right minister's position was naturally the most important. The imperial court tended to be younger, but it was not to the extent that there was a gap between the old and the young. The Wang family, the Shun family, and a limited number of officials with experience and ability could all be choices. There was no need to consider the Shun family. In the imperial court, it was impossible for the left and right ministers to come from the Shun family. The Shen family would not participate, and the officials would not agree. The other officials were at a disadvantage in the struggle for the position of prime minister, either because they did not have enough experience or because they did not have enough background. On the surface, the Wang family had the greatest hope. Because of the empress, the officials were almost certain that the Wang family would rise to a higher level this time. However, His Majesty stood his ground against the opinions of the masses and wanted to bestow the position of right minister to County Marquis Li. This made all the officials' jaws drop. Although His Majesty favored County Marquis Li, he had to be fair to all the officials in the imperial court. It was a bit too much to be swayed by emotions and want to pile all the good things on County Marquis Li. What's more, the position of prime minister was not a cabbage. It was the cornerstone of the imperial court. It needed both ability and experience. No one doubted County Marquis Li's ability, but his experience, forget it. Let's not talk about experience. In the past 2 years, a certain atmosphere had been formed in the imperial court. They only talked about ability, not experience. If you can do it, you can do it. If you can't, you can replace someone else. Don't mention who your father is or who your grandfather is. Of course, if the two people's ability was similar, it would depend on the father or the grandfather. As for County Marquis Li, no one doubted his ability. Because he was too capable and too young, they didn't care about the lack of experience. They didn't even care about whether there was such a precedent. But the problem was, he was lazy. Although he held a high position, many of the officials could only see him once a year at the imperial court. He was the dean of the School of Mathematics, but he only treated the School of Mathematics as a fishing ground. He was capable, but he was lazy. If County Marquis Li really became the prime minister, what was the difference between the imperial court and having only one prime minister? At that time, Prime Minister Shun would have to deal with all the affairs in the imperial court alone, and it would not be long before he resigned and retired. Li Xian's idea naturally attracted the opposition of the officials. Of course, for them, County Marquis Li had no other shortcomings except laziness. Their opposition was still very vague. Even so, the atmosphere between the emperor and the officials was still a bit unpleasant. Li found that he knew Li Xian better than himself. Could this guy's brain really not work a little bit? You can leave the position of the right prime minister to the Wang family or Dong Wenyan. Li looked at him solemnly and said, "Don't give me any more trouble. If you dare to make me prime minister, I will immediately leave the capital. I know you don't care, but I just don't like how they act." Li Xian snorted coldly and said, "Since I, the emperor, can't decide anything, why do they want me to be the emperor?" Li looked at him and asked back, "Do you think you can do whatever you want as the emperor?" Li Xian waved his hand and said, "The more they want it, the more I don't want to give it to them." "The more you don't want it, I still have to give it to you." Li Yi thought for a moment and said, "Since it has come to this, in fact, what I said just now was all a lie. As a scholar who doesn't want to become a general and become a prime minister, I refuse because I know that the more I don't want it, the more you want to give it to me. This is the simplest way to advance by retreating. Do you understand?" Li Xian looked at him and frowned. "So, you also want to be the prime minister?" Li Yi nodded solemnly and said, "Now that it has come to this, I won't hide it from you. I really want to be the prime minister." "If you want to be the prime minister, you should have said so earlier." Li Xian slapped his thigh and said, "If you had said so earlier, I would have agreed when Prime Minister Qin resigned for the first time. I was afraid that you wouldn't be happy. Now, I will issue the decree in the morning court tomorrow. One must abide by the rules. Those who don't play by the rules should be struck by lightning. Young master, old Lu is here." Just when Li Yi was wondering why he became so despicable after becoming the emperor, Fong came in with County Magistrate Lu. Lu Daiyou could be said to be the epitome of the saying, "One never comes to a temple without a cause." Every time he came, there must be something big, and it was something bad. Therefore, Fong privately called him a jinx. "Lu Daiyou greets your majesty." Lu Daiyou first bowed to Li Xian respectfully before turning around and bowing. "Lord Li." Li looked at him and asked, "Lord Lu, could it be that something big has happened this time?" Lu Daiyou shook his head and said, "It's nothing big. It's just that two young men were jealous of a girl in a brothel and tore down a brothel. Both of them were slightly injured and are now being detained by the county government. There is no need for Luda to make a trip here just to tell him about the fight between the two playboys." Li Yi thought for a moment and asked, "I'm guessing that one of the young men should be surnamed Li, right?" Lu Daiyou nodded and said, "One of them is Li Yingjie, the eldest son of Assistant Minister Li of the Ministry of Personnel. What about the other one?" "The other one is surnamed Wang. Li Yingjie was the son of his second uncle, Li Mingze, who was about the same age as him. Li had seen him many times, but had never talked to him much. Madame Dowager often mentioned him, saying that he had changed his previous playboy character, which was very rare. Not to mention that his father was an assistant minister of the Ministry of Personnel who was on the rise in his career. There were not many people in the capital who would take the initiative to provoke him just because of his surname." Lu Daiyou's arrival had explained everything. Li Yi stood up and said, "Let's go and have a look. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.